Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was late, probably past 2 in the morning, and I'd been driving for hours through the back end of nowhere. The snowstorm earlier in the day had left the road slick, and the temperature had dropped so low that the inside of my truck cab was barely warm even with the heat cranked up. My eyelids were heavy, and I knew I needed to stop before I nodded off at the wheel. I spotted a rest stop off the highway, one of those small, single-lot ones with just a couple of vending machines and no real facilities except for a couple of porta potties shoved against the edge of the lot. There was only one other vehicle there when I pulled in. It was an older pickup truck, idling with its lights on but looking like it had been parked for a while. The thing was covered in snow, and I could see steam rising from its hood, so I figured someone must be sitting inside with the heat running. It wasn't unusual. A lot of drivers will pull off to warm up or take a nap. The engine running made sense if they didn't want to freeze in their sleep. I parked a few spots over, turned off my engine, and sat there for a minute, rubbing my eyes and stretching. The cab was quiet except for the faint hiss of the cooling engine. Outside, the snow was still piled high, and the plow hadn't been through for hours, leaving a few inches of slush to navigate. I figured I'd step out, stretch my legs, and maybe grab something from the vending machine before trying to catch an hour of sleep. As soon as I opened the door, the cold hit me hard. The wind was sharp, and the air stung my face. I glanced over at the pickup as I stepped down. Its windows were fogged up, but I didn't see any movement inside. I waved, just in case the driver was awake and looking my way. No response. I walked across the lot, my boots crunching in the snow. The vending machines were on the far end of the rest stop, and the closer I got to the pickup, the more I realized something was off. The driver's seat was empty. There wasn't anyone in the truck at all. That didn't make sense. Why leave your truck running, especially out here? Gas wasn't cheap, and no one was around to steal the thing if you turned it off. I slowed down, glancing around the lot and the edges of the woods that lined the area. Everything was quiet except for the hum of the idling engine. The headlights threw long beams across the snow, cutting into the darkness beyond, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe the driver had stepped away for a minute or gone into the woods for some reason. People do weird things, and I didn't want to start jumping to conclusions. Still, the empty truck and the eerie quiet unsettled me. I made it to the vending machine and fumbled in my pocket for change. The wind whistled past, making me shiver. I was halfway through deciding between a bag of chips and a candy bar when I heard a noise behind me. It was faint at first, like snow crunching underfoot, but steady. Someone was moving. I turned around, expecting to see the truck's driver coming back. At first, I didn't see anything, just the faint outlines of the trees and the beams of my own headlights cutting across the lot. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the edge of the woods. A man stepped out from between the trees. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a beanie, but what struck me was how deliberate his movements were. He wasn't in any hurry. He just walked out like he knew exactly where he was going. His face was mostly in shadow, but I could see the glint of his eyes catching the light. I stood there for a second, frozen in place. I wasn't sure if I should say something or wait to see what he'd do. He didn't look at the pickup, which I'd expected if it was his. Instead, he kept walking, heading straight across the lot toward me. I told myself he probably just needed help. Maybe his car had broken down, or he'd gotten lost in the storm. But something about the way he moved made me uneasy. There was no hesitation, no waving or calling out. He didn't try to explain himself. He just kept coming. I stepped back, putting the vending machine between us. My boots slipped a little in the slush, and the sound seemed too loud in the silence. He stopped about 20 feet away, tilting his head like he was sizing me up. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air felt heavy, like the cold had sucked all the sound out of the night. "Hey," I finally called out, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. "You okay?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the idling pickup. I followed his gaze, and for the first time, I noticed something else. The driver's door was open now. Wide open. I was sure it had been shut when I walked past it earlier. I felt my chest tighten. There was no way he could have opened it without me hearing, not unless he'd done it before I even stepped out of my truck. And if he had, where had he been hiding all this time? The man started walking again, not toward the truck, but toward me. His pace was slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. My instinct screamed at me to get back to my truck, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. I edged away, keeping my eyes on him, my breath clouding in the air. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to sound firm. My hand fumbled for my keys in my pocket. "If you need help, just say so." He still didn't respond. He just kept walking. His boots crunched in the snow, steady and deliberate, and with every step, my pulse pounded harder. I took another step back, then another, until I was close enough to my truck to feel the metal of the door handle behind me. That's when he stopped. He was only about 10 feet away now, close enough that I could see his face clearly. There was something off about it. His expression was blank, almost too calm, like he wasn't even really looking at me. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Instead, he just stood there, watching me, as if he was waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I yanked the door open, jumped into the cab, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into reverse, backing out of the spot so fast that the tires skidded on the ice. As I pulled away, I glanced back toward the lot. The man was still standing there, exactly where I'd left him, watching me with that same blank expression. The pickup truck was still idling, its headlights cutting through the falling snow, but the driver's seat was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the highway. The rest stopped long behind me. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I'd finally found some peace. It was one of those quiet streets where nothing much seemed to happen. Neighbors kept to themselves, houses were spaced just far enough apart, and the streetlights gave everything a warm, safe glow at night. I was renting a small place at the end of the road, a cozy one-bedroom with a little porch and a lot of charm. It felt right. The first time I noticed something odd, it seemed like such a small thing. My mail had been arriving late, or sometimes not at all. A bill here, a catalog there, missing a few things didn't strike me as strange. The postal service can be unreliable, I told myself. But then it happened more often. Packages I was expecting never showed up, even though tracking numbers said they were delivered. A friend sent me a birthday card with cash inside, but I never got it. I called the post office to complain. They said everything was showing as delivered. The carrier even double-checked and insisted he'd drop the items off. So I figured someone might be taking the mail from my box. It didn't sit right with me, but I tried to be rational. Maybe a bored teenager or some desperate person looking for cash or valuables. I went out and bought a small security camera, one of those easy to install ones that sync to your phone. I put it on the porch, pointed at the mailbox, thinking it would solve the problem. For a week or two, nothing happened. Then, one night, the motion alert on my phone woke me up. I checked the feed and saw someone standing at my mailbox. It was a man, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He was tall, with his hood pulled low, and he didn't even glance at the camera. He just opened the mailbox, reached in, and pulled out a stack of papers. He didn't rush. He stood there for a moment, flipping through the mail, before tucking it under his arm and walking off down the street. I didn't sleep much that night. The footage made my skin crawl, but at least I had proof. I went to the police the next morning, showed them the video, and filed a report. They said they'd send someone to drive through the area more often, but there wasn't much else they could do. I thought that would be the end of it. But things got worse. It started with little things. My keys weren't where I'd left them. A pair of shoes was moved to the other side of the entryway. A mug I'd left on the counter was suddenly in the sink. I told myself I was being forgetful. I just moved in, after all, and I was still getting used to the place. But the feeling in my stomach didn't agree. It felt wrong, like the air in the house was heavier somehow. One morning, I woke up and couldn't find my wallet. I'd left it on the coffee table the night before. I looked everywhere, under cushions, in drawers, even checked the car, but it was gone. That's when I decided to move the camera inside. I had a second one, meant for watching the porch, but I put it in the living room instead, angled toward the front door. Just in case. The next night, I left it running while I slept. I woke up around 3 in the morning to another motion alert. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and opened the app. At first, I didn't see anything on the live feed. The living room was dark, just the faint outlines of furniture visible in the moonlight through the windows. Then the figure stepped into frame. It was the same man. The hood was up again, hiding most of his face, but I could tell it was him. He moved slowly, methodically, walking around the room like he belonged there. He didn't make a sound, but I could see the way he turned his head, looking at everything. He stopped at the coffee table, reached down, and picked up my phone charger. Then he moved toward the bookshelf, running his fingers over the spines of books like he was browsing. I couldn't breathe. He was in my house. While I was asleep, just down the hall. I froze, staring at the screen, too scared to even get out of bed. He didn't stay long. After a couple of minutes, he turned and walked back toward the front door. The feed cut off as he left the frame. I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone, not sure what to do. Calling the police crossed my mind, but what would I say? He was gone already. I wasn't even sure how he'd gotten in. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. There was no sign of forced entry. The next morning, I checked the camera footage again, trying to see if I'd missed anything. That's when I noticed it. The way he moved, the way he turned his head, it was like he knew exactly where the camera was. He never looked directly at it, but he stayed just on the edge of the frame, like he knew how to avoid being caught fully. I called a locksmith that day and had the locks changed. I added deadbolts, put a chain on the front door, and even ordered one of those bars you wedge under the doorknob. For good measure, I put another camera in the hallway outside my bedroom. I didn't care if it seemed paranoid. I needed to feel safe. The following night, I stayed up late, too nervous to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, the motion alert went off again. I hesitated, my hand shaking as I grabbed my phone and opened the app. The man was back. This time, he was in the hallway. He was standing still, right in front of the camera, staring directly into the lens. His hood was down, and I could see his face clearly for the first time. He was older than I'd expected, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, with deep lines around his eyes and a thin, scruffy beard. But it was his expression that sent chills through me. He wasn't angry or menacing. He was calm, almost blank, like he was just waiting. And then, as I watched, he smiled. I don't remember getting out of bed. I just remember grabbing my keys and my phone and running out the back door as fast as I could. I didn't even bother putting on shoes. I got in my car and drove straight to the nearest gas station, where I called the police. They came quickly this time. When they searched the house, they found the front door unlocked, even though I was sure I'd bolted it before bed. There were no signs of forced entry, but the officer told me they found a small, homemade tool outside the door, a piece of metal shaped like a key. I didn't go back to the house after that. I packed up my things during the day, with a couple of friends helping me, and moved to a new place across town. The police said they patrol the area more often, but they never caught him. I still don't know how long he'd been coming into the house or what he was looking for. All I know is that he knew more about me than I'd ever want anyone to know. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he still does. It was a freezing night, and I was standing at the bus stop just off campus. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that comes when it's too late for most people to still be out. The cold air stung my face, and I kept shifting from one foot to the other to stay warm. I had just finished a study session at the library and was waiting for the last bus to take me back to my apartment. The bus stop was a simple shelter, open on one side, with a bench covered in a thin layer of frost. There was no one else around, just me and the sound of the wind pushing through the empty street. I glanced at my phone. The bus was running late, of course. 10 more minutes at least, and I didn't have gloves, so my hands were shoved deep into my coat pockets. That's when I noticed him. At first, it was just movement in the corner of my eye. Across the street, near the edge of the shadows, a man was pacing back and forth. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a hoodie that looked way too thin for how cold it was. His hands were moving, fidgeting like he couldn't keep them still. I tried not to look directly at him, but something about the way he moved made me uneasy. It was too deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I kept my head down, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I could still see him out of the corner of my eye. He stopped pacing and just stood there, facing my direction. I told myself he probably wasn't even looking at me. Maybe he was just another student or someone waiting for a ride. But the street was empty, and there was no reason for him to just be standing there. A minute passed. Then another. The man started walking, crossing the street toward the bus stop. I felt my stomach tighten. I told myself not to panic. He was probably just cold and looking for somewhere to stand out of the wind. That's all. When he reached the bus shelter, he stopped a few feet away from me. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, too close for comfort, staring off into the distance. I could feel his presence more than I could see him, and my mind kept racing through what I should do. There wasn't anywhere to go. The next closest bus stop was several blocks away, and I didn't want to leave the light of the shelter. "Hey," he said, his voice low but not quite friendly. I didn't look up right away, hoping maybe he'd just leave me alone. But then he spoke again, louder this time. "Hey, man, you got any cash?" I turned toward him, trying to keep my expression neutral. "No, I don't carry cash," I said. It was true. I usually just used my card for everything. The man tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. His eyes were sharp, narrowing as he took a step closer. "Come on," he said. "You gotta have something. A couple of bucks. Help a guy out." "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound firm but not rude. "I really don't have anything." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took another step closer, so close now that I could see his breath clouding in the air. His expression changed, hardening into something that made my chest tighten. "You expect me to believe that?" he said, his voice colder now. "You're standing here, looking all comfortable in your nice coat, and you're telling me you don't have a single dollar?" I didn't answer. My throat felt dry, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to take a small step back, but there was nowhere to go without leaving the shelter completely. The man's tone shifted again, becoming sharper. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just brush me off like I'm nothing?" "I'm not trying to do that," I said quickly, keeping my hands in my pockets so he wouldn't see them shaking. "I really don't have any cash on me." "I'm sorry." For a moment, he just stared at me, his jaw tightening. Then he laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that made you feel at ease. It was short, clipped, almost bitter. "You're full of crap," he said. "Empty your pockets." My heart felt like it stopped for a second. "What?" I asked, even though I'd heard him perfectly. "I said empty your pockets," he repeated, his voice rising. "Now." I looked around, hoping, praying that someone else might walk by, that the bus might pull up, anything. But the street was still empty, and the night felt darker and colder than before. The man took another step closer, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. He was angry, but more than that, he was unpredictable. I couldn't tell if he was bluffing or if he was ready to escalate things further. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do. If I ran, he could catch me. If I stayed, I didn't know how far he'd push. "I don't have anything," I said again, my voice shaking now despite my efforts to stay calm. "Please, just leave me alone." He didn't move right away. He just stood there, staring me down. Then, without warning, he reached into the pocket of his hoodie. My whole body tensed, and I thought about running, but before I could decide, the man pulled out a small knife. It wasn't huge, but it was sharp enough to make his point. "Last chance," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Empty your pockets, or I'll do it for you." I couldn't think straight. My hands felt frozen, like they wouldn't move even if I wanted them to. I started to back away, but he stepped forward, closing the distance again. That's when I heard it, the sound of an engine. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, and headlights appeared at the end of the street. The bus was finally coming. The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the approaching vehicle. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. The second his attention wavered, I turned and ran toward the bus, waving my arms to make sure the driver saw me. My legs felt heavy, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The bus pulled up to the curb, and I didn't even look back as I jumped on board. The driver gave me a strange look, probably wondering why I was so out of breath, but I didn't explain. I just found a seat and slumped into it, my heart racing. As the bus pulled away, I finally glanced out the window. The man was still standing at the stop, watching the bus leave. He didn't run after it or try to follow, but the look on his face stayed with me long after he disappeared from view. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder, more deliberate, like he was memorizing my face. I didn't sleep much that night. Even now, I can't stand waiting at that bus stop alone. I'd rather walk an extra mile to the next one than risk seeing him again. I went hiking alone one Saturday in early winter. The trail was quiet, and the air had that sharp, cold feeling that bites at your face but makes the exercise feel worth it. It was one of those days when the world felt empty in the best way. No cars, no noise, just me, the trees, and the sound of my boots crunching the frozen dirt. I liked that trail because it wasn't popular. No tourists, no big crowds, just an old path winding through a dense forest with a couple of steep hills that made it feel like a workout. About 3 miles in, the trail narrowed and the trees thickened. I hadn't seen anyone since I started, which didn't surprise me. It was cold, and the sky looked like it might snow later. The forest felt still, almost heavy, like the air wasn't moving at all. That's when I saw something on the side of the trail. It was a bright blue backpack, partially unzipped with its contents spilling out onto the ground. At first, I thought someone had dropped it. People forget things all the time when they're out hiking, especially if they're in a hurry or carrying too much. But as I got closer, something about it made me stop. The backpack wasn't just dropped, it looked like it had been rifled through. Clothes were half pulled out, a water bottle was tipped over, and there were a few scattered papers fluttering in the weak breeze. I hesitated, looking around. The trail was empty, as far as I could see. I didn't hear anyone nearby, no footsteps, no voices. It felt strange to just leave it there, though, so I crouched down to take a closer look. There was a phone lying on the ground next to the bag. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. When I pressed the button to wake it up, I saw several missed calls and a bunch of unread texts. Most of them were from the same name, Rachel. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I don't know why it bothered me so much, but the whole scene felt off. I picked up the phone and looked around again, half expecting someone to come running back down the trail yelling about their lost stuff. But the forest was still quiet, too quiet. I thought about calling the number that had been trying to reach the phone, but before I could decide, I heard a sound behind me. It was faint, just the crack of a branch, but it was close enough to make me jump. I spun around, and there he was. A man stepped out from the trees, about 20 feet away. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a knit hat, and his face was pale. For a second, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's mine," he said, his voice low but steady. He pointed at the backpack. I stood up slowly, still holding the phone. "This is yours?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. I must have dropped it. He didn't seem in a hurry to grab it, though. He just kept looking at me, his eyes flicking between the backpack and the phone in my hand. Something about him made my skin crawl. His clothes didn't match the weather, no gloves, no scarf, just that thin jacket, and he wasn't carrying anything else. No water bottle, no map, nothing. Most hikers, even casual ones, at least bring a little gear. "I found it like this," I said, nodding at the scattered contents. "It looks like it's been here for a while." His smile twitched, and he took another step closer. "Yeah, well, I was looking for it," he said. "Thanks for finding it. You can just leave it there." He didn't make a move to pick it up. He just stood there, staring at me. The forest felt even quieter now, like the air was holding its breath. Every instinct I had was telling me something was wrong. "Do you know someone named Rachel?" I asked, holding up the phone. His expression changed then, just for a second. It was subtle, but I saw it, a flicker of something sharp and angry before the smile snapped back into place. "Yeah," he said slowly. "That's my sister. She's probably been trying to reach me. Can I have my phone back?" I didn't move. My hands felt cold, and not just from the weather. Your sister's been trying to call you? I asked. Why didn't you answer? His smile dropped. What are you, a cop? He snapped, taking another step closer. I said it's mine. Just give it back. I took a step back, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. I don't think this is your bag, I said, my voice shaking despite my best effort to stay calm. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I noticed how olive he looked, like he hadn't slept in days. You think I'm lying? He said, his voice low and cold. Why would I lie about something like this? I didn't answer. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I glanced down at the bag, and that's when I saw it, a smear of something dark on the strap. It looked like dried blood. The man saw me notice, and his whole demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed, and he took a step toward me, faster this time. Listen, he said, his voice rising. You don't know what you're talking about. Just put the phone down and walk away. I backed up again, my pulse racing. I'm leaving, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. You can take your bag. I don't want any trouble. He didn't respond. He just kept coming, his movements quicker now, more deliberate. I turned and started walking fast down the trail, not running, but close to it. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. He wasn't calling after me anymore. He was just following, the sound of his boots getting louder and louder. I don't know how far I walked like that, my whole body tense, waiting for him to grab me. When the trail opened up into a clearing, I finally turned around. He was still there, maybe 20 feet back, standing at the edge of the trees. His face was shadowed, but I could see the glint of his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I broke into a full sprint, my breath coming in sharp bursts as I ran. The trail was slippery, and I almost fell twice, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the parking lot, it was empty except for my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out onto the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I never went back to that trail. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I can't stop thinking about the look in his eyes and the way he followed me without saying a word. Whatever was in that backpack, it wasn't his. I'm sure of that. It was close to midnight, and the office was empty except for me. I had stayed late finishing a project that was due first thing in the morning. Everyone else had cleared out hours ago, and the building was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. Outside, the weather had turned colder, and a light snow was starting to stick to the streets. I saved my work, shut down my computer, and grabbed my coat. The parking garage was underground, accessed through a long, echoing stairwell. I hated going down there late at night. The overhead lights in the garage buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that always made the place feel bigger than it was. I told myself I was just being dramatic. I worked in this building every day. It was fine. As I opened the heavy metal door that led into the garage, the echo of my footsteps sounded sharper than usual. The cold air hit me, and I pulled my coat tighter. My car was parked near the far end of the lot, row D. Most of the spaces were empty now, leaving the garage feeling even more exposed. About halfway to my car, I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought they were mine, bouncing off the concrete walls. But as I stopped walking to check my phone, the sound didn't stop. The footsteps were still there, steady and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around quickly, but I didn't see anyone. Just the long rows of parked cars and the dull light reflecting off the cement floor. I stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. Maybe I was imagining it, or maybe someone else was just heading to their car. I shook it off and started walking again, my shoes tapping against the concrete. The sound came again. This time, it was closer. A sharp, deliberate tap tap tap, echoing behind me. I glanced back over my shoulder and caught a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping behind one of the support columns. My heart jumped, and I stopped walking. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. The only response was the hum of the overhead lights. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It's just someone else in the garage, I told myself. Maybe they're messing around, or they don't want to scare me. I started walking again, faster this time, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. My car wasn't far. I kept looking over my shoulder, but nothing moved. The garage seemed to stretch out in all directions, the shadows between the cars darker than they should have been. As I approached my car, I fumbled with the key fob, my fingers stiff with cold and nerves. That's when I heard it again, this time closer than before. I whipped around just in time to see a figure darting behind another column, their movement quick and deliberate. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking now. My eyes scanned the rows of cars and columns, but the figure didn't reappear. The shadows seemed deeper, the light overhead buzzing louder in the stillness. My pulse was racing, and my skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. I unlocked my car and yanked the door open, sliding in and slamming it shut behind me. My hands were trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of empty parking spaces. Empty, except for the movement at the edge of the light, a man stepping out from behind a column. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his jeans, and he stood there, staring directly at my car. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a moment, neither of us moved. He didn't say anything, didn't wave or gesture. He just stood there, his head slightly tilted, watching me. I threw the car into reverse, my tires squealing against the cement as I backed out of the space. I didn't take my eyes off him, afraid of what he might do if I looked away. As I shifted into drive and sped toward the exit, he started walking, not running, but moving steadily toward me. The way he walked, calm and unhurried, sent chills through me. The exit ramp felt like it stretched on forever, the slope steeper than I remembered. When I finally burst out into the night, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there in the middle of the street. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, the engine idling as I tried to steady my breathing. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been waiting for me in that garage. It wasn't random. He knew what he was doing. The way he moved, the way he watched me, it was deliberate. And the way he followed me without ever breaking stride, like he knew I couldn't do anything about it, made my stomach turn. I've started parking closer to the office entrance, even if it means paying extra for a different spot. I don't stay late anymore, no matter how much work I have to finish. I can't. That garage felt like a trap that night, and I still don't know how close I came to being caught in it. I was on a long road trip, trying to cover as many miles as I could before the weather got worse. It was early winter, and the forecasts kept talking about icy conditions. By the time it was fully dark, I could barely keep my eyes open. The snow started to pick up, and I knew I had to stop for the night. I pulled off at the next exit and saw a motel sign flickering in the distance. It looked a little run down, but I didn't care. I just needed a bed and a lock on the door. Inside, the lobby was quiet, just a tired-looking man at the desk. He didn't ask many questions, handed me a key, and pointed me to a room at the far end of the lot. I drove my car around, parked in front of the door, and carried my bag inside. The room smelled a little stale, but it was warm, and that was enough. There was a bed, a small TV, and a door on the far wall with a sign that said connecting room. It was locked with a deadbolt on my side. I made sure the deadbolt was turned all the way before I set my bag down. I was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. My head felt foggy, like I was still half asleep. I lay there for a minute, listening. The heater was humming, and the wind outside was rattling the window. But there was something else. A faint scraping sound. It was coming from the connecting door. I sat up slowly, my heart starting to race. I stared at the door, trying to make sense of the noise. It was steady, like someone dragging something metal against the door frame. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam lit up the door, and I could see the handle jiggle slightly. Someone was on the other side. I froze, not knowing what to do. Then, as if he could hear my thoughts, a voice came through the crack in the door. "I know you're in there," a man said, his voice low and rough. "Why don't you open up? Let's talk." My chest tightened, and I stayed completely still, hoping he'd think the room was empty. But then he laughed softly, like he knew I was listening. "You're awake, aren't you? I can hear you breathing." The sound of the scraping changed, and I realized he was trying to slide something thin, maybe a knife, into the gap between the door and the frame. I grabbed my phone and started dialing 911, but the screen said no service. The storm must have knocked out the signal. I looked around the room, trying to figure out what to do. There was a wooden chair by the small table, so I dragged it over as quietly as I could and wedged it under the doorknob. My hands were shaking, and the scraping sound didn't stop. It felt like he was taking his time, like he wasn't in any hurry. "You know, these locks aren't that strong," he said, his voice calm. "You should have stayed somewhere nicer. They've got better security." He laughed again, and I could hear him leaning against the door. His weight made the hinges creak slightly. I wanted to scream, to bang on the walls and hope someone else in the motel would hear me, but I didn't. I was too scared of what he might do if he knew I was panicking. Then, the handle turned. It stopped against the deadbolt, but the way it moved sent chills through me. He was testing it, seeing how much force it would take to break it. "You think this will hold me back?" he said, almost amused. "I'll be in there soon. You can't stop me." I grabbed my bag and started searching for anything I could use as a weapon. The only thing I had was a small pair of scissors I used for cutting tags off clothes. They felt useless in my hand, but I clutched them anyway. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I thought maybe he had given up, but then I heard a loud thud against the door. He was throwing his weight into it, trying to break it open. The chair held, but the sound made my stomach drop. He hit it again, harder this time. The frame groaned under the pressure. I backed up against the far wall, holding the scissors in front of me like they would do anything if he got through. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said, his voice louder now. "Just open the door. It'll be easier for both of us." Another crash. The door shook, and I could see the deadbolt starting to bend. I thought about running out the front door, but what if he was faster? What if someone else was waiting outside? I was trapped. Then I remembered my car keys. My car was parked right outside. If I could make it there, I might have a chance. I grabbed my bag, my phone, and the keys, and crept toward the door. I tried to be as quiet as possible, but the floor creaked under my weight. He must have heard it, because he stopped pounding on the door. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone almost playful. Then, another crash, and the wood near the deadbolt started to splinter. I didn't wait. I threw the front door open and ran to my car. The cold air hit me like a punch, and the snow was deeper than I expected. I slipped but managed to catch myself, my feet sliding as I reached the driver's side. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As the headlights came on, I saw him. He was standing in the doorway of my room, his face hidden by the shadows. He didn't move, just stood there watching as I put the car in reverse and slammed on the gas. The tires spun for a moment on the icy pavement before they caught, and I shot backward. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't even care that I was heading into the storm. Anything was better than staying there. I never went back to that motel, never even reported what happened. I couldn't. The thought of explaining it, of having to relive it, was too much. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the sound of his voice, calm and confident, as he tried to break through that door. It's something I still hear in my nightmares. I had been driving for hours, too tired to keep going but still far from home. It was nearly midnight when I spotted a small diner off the highway, one of those places with a neon sign that buzzes faintly in the cold night air. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for an old sedan parked near the door. I pulled in, hoping for a coffee strong enough to keep me awake for the next stretch of road. Inside, the diner was quiet. The lighting was dim, and the faint hum of a radio played somewhere behind the counter. A waitress stood at the far end, wiping down the already spotless counter. I nodded at her as I slid into a booth by the window. The only other person there was a man sitting 2 booths down from me. He was hunched over a cup of coffee, his face partially hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. The waitress came over, handed me a menu, and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes, and she disappeared behind the counter again. I stared out the window, trying to shake the exhaustion from my head. The snow outside had started to fall heavier, blanketing the cars and the empty road. It was so quiet that the sound of the bell above the door startled me when the waitress brought the coffee over. I sipped it slowly, letting the warmth spread through me. After a minute, I felt eyes on me. I glanced over, and the man in the baseball cap was looking at me. Not just a casual glance, but full-on staring. His cup was still in his hand, but he wasn't drinking anymore. "Long drive?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. I hesitated, not really in the mood to talk but not wanting to be rude. "Yeah," I said, keeping my answer short. He nodded like he already knew the answer. "Where are you heading?" "Home," I replied. I didn't offer more than that. Something about the way he asked felt off, like he wasn't just making small talk. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Middle of nowhere out there," he said. "Not a lot of people around at this time of night." I gave a half-hearted nod and went back to my coffee, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't. He slid out of his booth and moved to sit across from me, uninvited. The smell of stale cigarettes and something sour hit me as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You pass through here often?" he asked. "No," I said, setting my coffee down. "Just passing through." "Funny," he said, tilting his head slightly. "I thought I saw you the other day. Down at the gas station by exit 212. You were filling up, right?" I froze for a second, my mind racing. I had stopped at a gas station near that exit earlier in the week, but I didn't remember seeing anyone like him. "You must have seen someone else," I said, keeping my voice steady. The man smiled again, whiter this time. "Maybe. But I'm pretty good with faces." I didn't respond. My stomach tightened, and I suddenly felt very aware of how empty the diner was. The waitress had disappeared into the kitchen, leaving just me and this guy. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the ticking sound louder now that the radio had gone silent. "You traveling alone?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Meeting someone later," I lied. "I'm not alone." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, you're not meeting anyone. You're out here by yourself, same as you were at that gas station. Same as when you pulled off at the rest stop yesterday." My chest tightened, and my hands gripped the edge of the table. I hadn't stopped at any rest stops yesterday, but the way he said it made me question my own memory. Was he guessing? Or had he really been following me? "I think you've got the wrong person," I said, my voice lower now. "I don't know you." The man leaned back in the booth, still smiling, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Oh, I know you," he said. "Been keeping an eye on you for a while now. Funny how you don't notice things when you're not paying attention." The words sent a chill down my spine. I thought about the stops I had made, the stretches of empty road where I hadn't seen another car for miles. Had he really been there the whole time? I stood up, reaching for my wallet. "I've got to go," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He stood up too, blocking my way to the door. "No rush," he said, his voice low. "Storm's just getting worse. You might as well stay a while. We could talk." I took a step back, my heart pounding. The man wasn't big, but there was something about the way he stood, like he was daring me to make a move. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said. "I'm just trying to get home." He didn't move. "Trouble?" "No, I don't think so. You seem like a smart guy. Careful, too. But not careful enough." My eyes darted to the counter. The waitress was still nowhere to be seen. I thought about shouting for her, but didn't want to take my eyes off him. Then, as if sensing my thoughts, he stepped aside. "Go on, then," he said, gesturing toward the door. "But I'll see you again." I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I walked quickly to the counter, dropped some cash for the coffee, and headed for the door. My hands were shaking as I pushed it open, the cold air hitting me like a slap. As I got to my car, I glanced back. The man was standing in the doorway, watching me, his hands shoved into his pockets. I fumbled with my keys, got the car started, and pulled out of the lot. My tires skidded on the icy pavement, but I didn't slow down. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his car following me, but the road stayed empty. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I found a crowded gas station and parked under the bright lights. I stayed there until the sun came up, too scared to close my eyes. I don't know if he was really following me or if he was just trying to scare me. But the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to know where I had been, made my skin crawl. Even now, I check my mirrors constantly when I'm driving. I don't take the same routes, and I avoid stopping at places that are too quiet. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was standing alone on the platform, waiting for the last train. The station was nearly silent except for the occasional crackle of the speaker announcing delays. It was one of those older stations where everything felt grimy, even the air. The kind of place you wouldn't want to linger if you didn't have to. But I had missed the earlier train, and I didn't have much of a choice. There was a man on the opposite platform. I didn't notice him at first because I'd been staring at my phone, trying to make the time pass faster. But when I glanced up, he was there, standing near one of the metal benches. He wasn't sitting, just leaning slightly with his hands in his pockets. He had on a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, so I couldn't see his face clearly. I thought maybe he was waiting for a train, same as me, but something about the way he was standing bothered me. He wasn't looking at the tracks or checking his phone like most people do. He was looking directly at me. I told myself not to overthink it. It was late, and people act strange sometimes. Maybe he didn't even realize he was staring. I shifted my position so I wasn't facing him, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling. A minute passed, maybe two, and I glanced back. He hadn't moved. He was still leaning there, still watching me. I started to feel a little sick. The platform was deserted except for the two of us, and I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet it was. The train wasn't due for another 10 minutes, which felt like an eternity. I tried to focus on my phone again, but my hands were shaking a little, and I kept glancing up, like I couldn't stop myself. Then he moved. Not a lot, just a shift of his weight, but it made me jump. He stepped forward, just one step, and stood there, now a little closer to the edge of the platform. I could feel my heart beating faster. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid, but something about him felt off. It wasn't just the staring. It was the stillness, the way he didn't fidget or pace like most people do when they're waiting for something. It was like he was waiting for me specifically. The train finally came, and I felt a rush of relief when I saw the headlights in the tunnel. I stepped closer to the edge of the platform, hoping it would break whatever weird tension was happening. As the train screeched to a stop, I climbed aboard without looking back. I headed straight for the middle of the car, sat down, and kept my head low, trying to shake off the uneasiness. But then I saw him. He had boarded the same train. He was in the car behind mine, standing near the door, facing me through the glass window. My stomach dropped. There were a dozen other cars he could have chosen, but he had picked the one closest to me. He wasn't even trying to eye it anymore. He was staring directly at me, his hood still up, his face partly hidden in shadow. I looked away, my mind racing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he just happened to get in the same car. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I could feel his eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. The train jerked forward, and I counted the seconds, hoping he'd get off at the next stop and this would all be over. He didn't. At the next station, the doors opened, but he stayed put. A few people got on, but the car was still mostly empty. He didn't sit down. He just stood there by the door, watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, clutching my bag, and walked toward the front of the car. My plan was to move to a different car, put some distance between us. I stepped into the space between the cars, the air cold and loud with the sound of the train speeding through the tunnel. I opened the door to the next car and slipped inside. It was quieter in here, and there were more people. I felt a little safer, but I couldn't stop myself from looking back. Through the window, I saw him again. He was following me. He had already left his car and was stepping into the same space between cars I had just crossed. I panicked. I moved quickly, walking to the far end of the car and slipping into the next one. I thought maybe if I kept moving, he'd give up, but he didn't. Every time I looked back, he was there, closing the distance between us. He wasn't running or rushing, just walking steadily, like he had all the time in the world. By the time I reached the third car, I was breathing hard, trying not to cry. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just keep running through the train forever. My stop was coming up, but the thought of getting off and being alone on the street with him made my skin crawl. I spotted the conductor up ahead, standing near the front of the car. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, and he looked tired, but he was my only hope. I hurried over to him, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. I didn't even care if I sounded crazy. I just wanted someone to help me. The conductor's face hardened when I pointed back toward the man. He nodded, told me to stay where I was, and started walking toward the rear of the car. I watched as he stepped into the space between cars, disappearing from view. For a moment, everything was quiet. I stayed near the front of the car, gripping the pole for balance as the train swayed. Then I heard voices, muffled at first, then louder. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it didn't sound friendly. A second later, the conductor came back, his expression tense. He told me the man had gotten off at the last stop. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. When the train finally pulled into my station, I hesitated. The conductor must have seen the fear on my face because he offered to walk me out. I nodded, grateful, and followed him onto the platform. The station was nearly empty, just a few stragglers heading for the exits. I didn't see the man anywhere, but I still felt exposed. The conductor stayed with me until I reached the stairs leading to the street. He gave me a reassuring nod before turning back toward the train. I hurried up the stairs, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was inside a taxi heading home. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again, but he was gone. Even now, I don't know what he wanted or why he was following me. I just know I never want to see him again. The first time I noticed the car, it was just before sunset. I was out by the chicken coop, making sure everything was locked up for the night. The days were getting shorter, and the shadows stretched long across the fields. That was when I saw it, an old, dark sedan parked on the dirt road that ran along the edge of my property. It wasn't a road anyone usually stopped on. It was bumpy, barely wide enough for one vehicle, and there was nothing out that way except my land and trees. The car wasn't running, but I could see someone sitting inside. The driver's window was rolled down just enough to show part of their head, but they were too far away for me to see their face clearly. I figured maybe they'd gotten lost or were having car trouble, but they weren't doing anything, no hazards, no one getting out to check the tires. They were just sitting there. I kept an eye on the car while I finished up with the chickens. When I went back to the house, I looked out the kitchen window. The car was still there, sitting in the same spot. It made me uneasy, but I told myself it wasn't my problem unless they came onto my land. After a while, I stopped checking and focused on finishing dinner. Later that night, I stepped out onto the porch to take the dogs out one last time. The car was gone. I felt relieved, but the whole thing still stuck in my head. It was odd, and I don't like things I can't explain. The next day passed quietly, but by evening, the car was back. Same spot, same time. It was like they were waiting for something. This time, I stood on the porch for a while, staring at them, trying to make it clear I'd noticed them. I even grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the car. They didn't react. The beam didn't reach far enough to show much, just a faint outline of the vehicle and the driver still sitting there. I thought about walking out to confront them, but decided against it. If they meant trouble, I didn't want to deal with it alone out there in the open. I figured if they were up to no good, they'd leave when they saw me watching. Around 9, I checked again, and the car was gone. By the third night, I was starting to feel paranoid. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had no business being there. When the car showed up again at dusk, I called the sheriff's department. Out here, you're on your own most of the time, but they promised to send someone out to drive by and check it out. I waited, watching from the porch with the dogs at my feet. The car didn't move. About 30 minutes later, I saw the headlights of the deputy's car coming down the road. The strange car pulled away just before the deputy reached it. They didn't speed off, just rolled slowly down the dirt road like nothing was wrong. The deputy followed after them, and I went back inside, thinking it was over. It wasn't. That night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, barely loud enough to register, but it pulled me out of a deep sleep. I lay there for a minute, trying to figure out if I'd imagined it. Then I heard it again. A metallic clink, followed by a soft scraping sound. It was coming from outside. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and went to the window. From there, I had a view of the barn. The moonlight was strong enough to light up the yard, and I could see a figure near the barn door. They were crouched down, doing something to the lock. My stomach dropped. I realized whoever it was had parked their car somewhere out of sight this time. They weren't just watching anymore, they were on my property. I grabbed my shotgun from the corner of the room and loaded it. I wasn't looking to hurt anyone, but I wasn't about to take chances either. I turned on the porch light and stepped out, trying to make as much noise as possible. The dogs started barking like mad, which I figured would scare them off. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sharp in the cold night air. "Get off my property." The figure froze for a second, then bolted. They ran toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows before I could get a good look at them. I didn't chase after them. I wasn't stupid enough to go running into the woods in the dark. Instead, I walked to the barn, keeping the shotgun ready, and checked the door. The lock was damaged, hanging loose where they'd been trying to pry it open. I felt sick. Whoever they were, they'd come prepared with tools. They knew what they were doing. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the kitchen with the shotgun across my lap. Every little noise outside made my heart race. I thought about calling the sheriff again, but I didn't see the point. By the time anyone got out here, they'd be long gone. The next morning, I walked the property, looking for any signs of them. I found fresh footprints near the barn leading toward the woods. There were tire tracks, too, farther down the road where they parked. I took pictures of everything and called the sheriff's department again. This time, they promised to send someone out to take a report. When the deputy showed up, I told him everything. He looked around, asked a few questions, and said they'd keep an eye on the area. He didn't seem too concerned, which frustrated me, but I couldn't do much about it. That evening, I made sure every door and window was locked tight. I moved the dogs inside and kept the shotgun within reach. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, but I wasn't going to let them catch me off guard again. Around midnight, the dogs started growling low and deep. My heart pounded as I listened, straining to hear what had set them off. Then I caught a faint rustling sound, like someone moving through the grass outside. I turned off the lights in the house, hoping to see better in the dark. I moved to the living room window and peeked out. There, near the side of the house, was the same figure from before. They were creeping toward the back door, holding something in their hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but it glinted in the moonlight. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait this time. I grabbed a shotgun, swung the back door open, and shouted, "Get the hell out of here." The person turned and ran, disappearing into the trees again. This time, I didn't stop to think. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare them enough that they wouldn't come back. The rest of the night passed without any more signs of them, but I didn't sleep. The sheriff came by again in the morning, took another report, and promised to increase patrols in the area. I don't know if they ever found the person. All I know is that the car hasn't come back, and the nights have been quiet since then. I still double-check the locks every night. I can't help but wonder what they wanted. It had been a long day. The library was quieter than usual, as most people had left by the time I began my closing routine. I'm the only one who works the late shift. The library was small, so it didn't require much to close it up. Just a few last-minute tidying, a quick sweep of the aisles to make sure no one was lingering, and I could lock up and head home. I usually did everything in a set order. First, I turned off the computers, then I straightened up the front desk, and finally, I walked through the aisles to make sure no one was still hiding out in the back. I was almost finished, ready to turn off the lights and lock the doors, when I noticed him. He was standing near the history section, just a little too still. It wasn't the first time I'd seen someone lingering after hours. People sometimes get caught up in books and lose track of time. But there was something about him that felt different. I wasn't far away when I first noticed him, maybe 20 feet or so, and when he saw me looking, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the shelves like he was deep in thought. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. But then I realized it was well past closing time, and we had to lock up. I walked toward him, trying to look as professional as possible, though I was starting to feel a little uneasy. "Excuse me, sir," I said as I got closer, my voice calm but firm. "The library's closing now. You'll need to finish up and head out." He turned slowly to face me. He wasn't very tall, but his presence made him seem bigger. He had a thick jacket on, even though it wasn't that cold outside, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His eyes were hard to make out, but I could see his jaw tightening. He didn't say anything right away. "I'm just looking for a book," he finally said, his voice low and almost hushed. I glanced around, trying to figure out what he was talking about. The history section was pretty well stocked, but it wasn't that big, and I couldn't see what he could be looking for. We didn't get many people coming in at this hour, so it struck me as odd that he'd still be looking for a book when it was clearly time to leave. I nodded slowly. "All right, well, I need to get the place locked up. If you want to find it quickly, I can help you. Just let me know what you're looking for." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step back, looking past me, almost like he was weighing whether or not he wanted to leave. I noticed the way he stood, a little too rigid, like he was keeping himself from moving too much. He was either trying to seem casual, or he was waiting for something. "I just need a minute," he said, his voice colder this time. I didn't like the tone. My gut was telling me to be careful. It was rare for someone to act like this, especially when they knew the library was about to close. The hairs on the back of my neck started to prickle, and I took a mental step back, considering my options. "Look," I said, taking a small step back myself. "I'm going to have to call security if you're not leaving. We're closing, and you can't be here after hours." At that, he looked up at me for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly. I could see his face better now. He had a scruffy beard and his features were sharp, his cheekbones high. He looked older than I had first assumed, maybe in his 40s, though he looked worn out, like he hadn't slept in days. The expression on his face was unreadable, like he was debating something in his mind. Before I could move toward the desk to pick up the phone, he stepped closer to me, blocking my path. I froze. He was too close now. "Please," he said, and there was a slight edge to his voice, something darker than before. "Just let me stay. I won't be any trouble." His voice dropped even lower, almost as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. But his body was tense, like he was preparing to do something, and I knew it wasn't just about a book anymore. My mind raced, and I took a slow, deliberate step back, keeping my eyes on him. I had to keep it together. There was no way I was going to let him trap me in the back of the library. "I need to call security now," I said again, but this time my voice wavered just a bit. I reached for the phone, but he stepped forward and grabbed my arm, pulling it back just slightly. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to stop me from getting away. I looked up at him, and I could see it now, the desperation in his eyes. It wasn't just about a book. It wasn't about anything that made sense. Something in him had snapped, or maybe it was always there. "You don't understand," he whispered, his grip tightening just enough to make me uneasy. "I just need to finish what I started." I had no idea what he meant by that, but I didn't have time to figure it out. My pulse was racing, and I could feel panic starting to rise. He was getting closer, his breath now out of my face. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I knew I had to get away, but I couldn't just push him. He was too close. If I made a move, I wasn't sure what he'd do. But I wasn't about to wait around to find out. My eyes darted to the door, and I realized there was a staff exit near the back of the library, not far from where we were standing. It was usually locked, but the emergency key was in my pocket. If I could just make a break for it. Before I could act, he stepped back, breaking the tension for a moment. It was just long enough for me to feel a small rush of relief. But then he did something that made my stomach drop. He pulled out a small object from his jacket pocket. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was metallic, and my first thought was that it might be a knife. I don't know why, but in that instant, my body went into autopilot. I grabbed my phone out of my pocket with trembling hands, hit the emergency button, and shoved the phone into my pocket as I bolted for the staff door. I could hear him behind me, shouting something, but I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I got to the door, fumbled with the keys, and forced it open. I slammed it behind me and ran down the hall to the back exit. I didn't look back once. I could still hear his voice, but I didn't dare slow down. When I got outside, I was out of breath, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't stop. I ran around the back of the building and out to the parking lot, where I saw a security guard approaching. I didn't know if the man followed me out, but I wasn't waiting around to find out. I ran straight to the guard, gasping for air, and told him everything. He immediately called for backup, and they swept the library, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. Afterward, I sat in my car, my hands still shaking. I knew I wasn't going to work another late shift again anytime soon. I haven't been back since, not after everything that happened. I never thought moving into my dream house would lead to anything like this. I had always wanted an older home, one with character, a little charm. So when I found this beautiful, two-story house on a quiet street, I jumped on it. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where people wave when they see you, where the trees shade the sidewalks in summer, and everything feels just right. It was a little over my budget, but I didn't mind. It was perfect, well, almost. It had hardwood floors, intricate molding, and a fireplace I imagined would look wonderful during the winter. It was just what I'd been looking for. I was thrilled to start the new chapter of my life. Unpacking felt like an endless task. I had already spent the better part of a week sorting through boxes, trying to make the place feel like home. I'd gotten most of the rooms settled, but the last part, the spare bedroom upstairs, was still a mess. That night, I was going through an old box of knickknacks and family mementos when I came across a loose floorboard in the corner of the room. It was slightly raised, and when I pried it up, I found something hidden beneath. At first, it didn't seem like much, just an old, dusty family portrait. The frame was tarnished, and the glass was foggy, but it looked like something that had been passed down through generations. It was a picture of a family, standing in front of this very house. There was a man, a woman, and a couple of children, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed something strange. The man in the picture, the father perhaps, had a look in his eyes that I can't really describe. They seemed strange, cold, and when I looked closer, it almost felt like his eyes were following me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was an old photo, likely worn from age. I placed the picture on the dresser, not thinking much about it. The next few days, things started to get weird. It started with the faucets. I would be in one room, and I'd hear the sound of running water. At first, I thought I had just left something on, maybe the sink in the bathroom or the kitchen. But when I checked, the faucets would be off. This happened multiple times. The first few instances, I tried to tell myself I was just being forgetful, but after a while, I couldn't deny something was off. Then the doors started creaking. At night, when I was getting ready to go to bed, I'd hear the distinct sound of a door opening. The first time it happened, I assumed I hadn't fully closed one of the rooms, but after checking, every door in the house was shut tight. I was getting a little more unnerved, but I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me. I kept going, unpacking and trying to settle in. It was a week later when it happened, the thing that really made me uneasy. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I heard it. A man's voice, faint but clear, calling my name. "Sophie," it said. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that I could feel it in my chest. I froze. My heart was pounding, and my breath caught in my throat. The voice had come from upstairs, from the attic. I tried to dismiss it as the house settling, as old homes often do, but this felt different. This felt intentional. I didn't know what to do. I was alone. My phone was in the other room, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. After a few minutes, I forced myself to go upstairs, but when I reached the attic door, it was locked. I didn't have a key, so I couldn't go in, but the air around the door felt thick. I could almost feel someone or something on the other side. Over the next few days, the occurrences escalated. I started noticing more oddities. Sometimes, the air would feel too cold in certain rooms, like a draft I couldn't find. The lights would flicker, and the electrical appliances would malfunction for no apparent reason. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, but I knew something wasn't right. I decided I had to get answers. I went outside one afternoon and approached the neighbors, an older couple who lived a few doors down. They'd always been polite when we waved to each other, so I figured they might know something about the house's history. At first, they were friendly, asking how I was settling in, but when I mentioned the house and asked if they knew anything about the previous owners, their demeanor changed. The woman, Mrs. Larkin, smiled politely but seemed a little too stiff. Her husband, Mr. Larkin, just stared at me for a long time without saying a word. "Well, that's a nice house," Mrs. Larkin said after a pause. "It's been empty for quite a few years before you moved in." I nodded. "Yeah, I gathered that. The previous owners, are they still around?" Mr. Larkin finally spoke, his voice low. "Not around here. They moved away years ago. After some issues." I felt a chill run down my spine, and I pushed further, asking what kind of issues they meant. Mrs. Larkin shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to her husband, who was now staring at me with an unreadable expression. "You should be careful," she said, her voice suddenly stern. "You're not alone in that house, Sophie. The past never stays quiet there." I didn't know what to say. The conversation quickly ended after that, with the Larkins offering cryptic warnings and awkward smiles before retreating inside their house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about their words, "You're not alone." What did that mean? What did they know that I didn't? I knew I had to leave. The house, my dream home, had become a prison. The whispers, the strange sounds, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up what I could and stayed with a friend for a few nights, trying to clear my head. When I returned to gather the rest of my things, I found the portrait again, the one hidden under the floorboard. It was still there, sitting on the dresser. The man in the photo was staring at me, his eyes colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The house, despite the quiet neighborhood, felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I don't know if the Larkins were right, but I couldn't live there anymore. That house wasn't mine. It belonged to someone or something else. Something that would never let me forget it. I left the house that night. I never went back. The Larkins were right about one thing. I was never alone in that house. And I don't think anyone ever really leaves it behind. The farmhouse was far from perfect, but for the price, I couldn't complain. It was the kind of place that looked better in photos, chipped white paint on the exterior, creaky floorboards inside, and a barn in the back that hadn't been used in years. The landlord had been upfront about it. Old, but livable, he'd said. That was good enough for me. The first few days were quiet. The nearest neighbors were a good half-mile away, and the isolation was something I'd wanted. I spent my mornings fixing up the place, patching holes in the walls and sweeping out cobwebs, and my evenings sitting on the porch, enjoying the peace. It wasn't until the 5th day that I noticed the letters. There was no name on the envelope, just my address scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words, "Leave while you can." I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank. Maybe the landlord had annoyed someone in the past, and they assumed I was connected to him. Still, it unsettled me. There was no return address, no hint of who might have sent it. I tossed it in the trash and tried to forget about it. The second letter arrived 2 days later. Same envelope, same shaky handwriting. This one said, "They're watching you." That was it. Nothing else. I started locking the doors after that. I hadn't bothered before because I didn't think anyone would bother me out there, but the letters changed that. I didn't tell anyone about them. Part of me thought I was overreacting, but another part felt like I needed to be on guard. The third letter arrived the next morning. "The barn isn't safe." That one gave me pause. The barn was on the far edge of the property, and I hadn't even stepped inside it yet. The roof was caved in on one side, and the doors hung crooked on their hinges. It didn't look like it had been used in years. I thought about calling the landlord, but what would I even say? Someone left me a creepy letter about the barn. It sounded ridiculous. That evening, I decided to check it out for myself. The rain had started up again, light but steady, and the grass squished under my boots as I crossed the yard. The barn door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound echoing inside. The air smelled damp and stale, like rot. I shone my flashlight around but didn't see much, just old tools, broken boards, and piles of straw. I walked further in, the beam of light sweeping the floor, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a mattress in the corner, filthy and stained, with an old blanket crumpled on top. Next to it was a pile of empty cans and wrappers. Someone had been living there. I backed out of the barn as quickly as I could, my heart racing. I locked the house up tighter than ever that night, dragging a chair in front of the door for good measure. The next morning, I called the landlord. He sounded annoyed when I told him about the letters and the mattress. "Nobody's lived in that barn for years," he said. "It's probably just some drifter passing through. I'll send someone to take a look." That didn't help much. I started jumping at every little sound, every creak of the house or rustle of the wind outside. The letters stopped for a while after that, and I thought maybe whoever was messing with me had moved on. Then, a week later, I saw him. It was late, just after midnight, and the rain was pouring down. I'd been lying in bed, listening to a drum against the roof, when I heard something else, a faint tapping sound. I sat up, straining to hear, and realized it was coming from the window. I pulled back the curtain, and my breath caught in my throat. A man was standing in the yard, just beyond the porch light, staring at me. His face was hard to make out through the rain, but I could see he was tall and thin, with long, stringy hair plastered to his face. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, whispering into the receiver so he wouldn't hear me. The dispatcher said someone would be out as soon as they could, but the storm was slowing everything down. When I looked back, the man was gone. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat in the kitchen with a knife clutched in my hand, every creak and groan of the house making me jump. When the police finally arrived, their headlights swept over the yard, but there was no sign of him. They looked around the property and found nothing but muddy footprints leading from the barn to the porch. The officers told me to stay inside and lock the doors. "Call us if you see anything else," one of them said, but his tone made it clear he didn't think it was anything serious. "Just some vagrant looking for shelter," they said. They didn't understand. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, rain dripping off his face, his eyes locked on mine. The next day, I packed my things. I didn't care about the lease or the money I'd lose by leaving. I just wanted to get out of there. As I loaded the last of my bags into the car, I glanced at the barn one last time. The doors were open, swinging slightly in the wind. For a moment, I thought I saw movement inside, a shadow shifting in the darkness. I didn't wait to find out. I got in the car and drove away, leaving the farmhouse and its secrets behind. I never found out who sent the letters or who the man in the yard was. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about him standing there, watching me through the rain. I went on a solo trip last fall to explore some old camping spots. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, but this trip felt different from the start. I had always wanted to check out this particular spot, a cabin in the woods that was rumored to be abandoned. It wasn't on any maps, but a friend had mentioned it once, and I figured I could find it with just a little off-trail hiking. No one had been up there in years, or at least that's what I thought. I'd spent the day hiking and was starting to get tired by the time I found the cabin. It was small, made of wood, and looked like it had seen better days. The roof was half collapsed in places, and the windows were boarded up with old planks. Still, it seemed solid enough, and I figured I could take a break, eat something, and maybe even stay the night there if I felt like it. I stepped inside, and it was musty, but not too bad. There was a small table in the middle, some broken chairs scattered around, and the usual decay you'd expect from an old and used building. There were cobwebs everywhere, but the place was sheltered from the wind, so I decided it would make a decent spot to rest for a bit. I was sitting at the table, trying to drink some water and warm up when I noticed something pinned to the wall near the doorway. At first, I thought it was just old paper, maybe a forgotten note or something someone had left behind, but when I got closer, I realized it was more than that. It was a handwritten note, scrawled quickly but legibly. The words read, "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. My heart started racing, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably just something left by some other hiker, maybe someone who felt the need to leave a mark. Still, the message made me uneasy. I turned my attention back to the cabin, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled in. But then I saw another note, this one stuck to the wall near the window. I took a slow step forward and read it. "Leave now. You're being watched." I felt the blood drain from my face. I stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do. I was getting scared, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a prank or some weird coincidence. Maybe it was just some messed up person who liked to leave notes like this in abandoned places. I didn't want to leave, though. It was late, and the thought of walking back into the woods after dark was terrifying. I needed to calm down, so I took a deep breath and started looking around the cabin again. I looked at the small, makeshift bed in the corner, a few remnants of what looked like a camping stove on the floor, and then I saw something else. A map was pinned to the wall next to the door, underneath the second note. The map looked old, hand-drawn, with a series of red marks and lines drawn on it. It didn't make much sense at first, but something caught my eye. There was a trail marked with a red X near the bottom of the map, and another note was taped underneath it. I moved closer and read it. The writing was a bit messy now, like the person was getting more frantic, or maybe just annoyed. "If you follow the path, you will find what you're looking for. It will be waiting." I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't want to touch anything, but I couldn't help myself. I ran my finger over the map. The X on the map was near the area I had hiked through earlier in the day. It wasn't far, but why was it marked? Why did this person want me to go there? And who was leaving these notes? I glanced around the cabin, suddenly feeling like the walls were closing in. Something wasn't right, and I felt the overwhelming urge to leave. But before I could gather my things, I saw yet another note, this one pinned under the windowsill. I hesitated for a long moment, but finally, I forced myself to walk over and read it. "It's too late. They're already coming for you." My heart slammed against my chest, and I had no idea what to do. This wasn't just some random prank anymore. Whoever had written these notes knew I was here. They knew where I was. And they were telling me to leave, but I didn't know where to go. I grabbed my backpack, slammed it shut, and rushed to the door. As I stepped outside, I froze. For the first time, I could hear something. The quiet woods were gone. There was a rustling sound, not far from the cabin, like someone or something was moving around in the trees. My stomach twisted in knots. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced. Should I go back? Should I stay inside? But no, I couldn't. I couldn't stay there any longer. I bolted into the woods, not knowing where I was going, just running away from the cabin. My legs burned from the effort, and my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was overthinking it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I heard footsteps behind me. It sounded like someone was following, their steps too slow, too deliberate, matching my pace. I could feel them getting closer, but when I looked behind, there was no one there. I picked up the pace, stumbling through the trees, knowing I couldn't stop for a second. I kept running until I couldn't hear anything except my own breath. The darkness felt thicker than before, the trees closing in around me. Eventually, I found a trail that led to the main road and sprinted out of the woods. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing following me anymore. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was safely driving down the road, away from the woods, away from that cabin, and away from whatever had been waiting there for me. I never went back to that place. I don't know who left those notes or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure, it wasn't a coincidence. I won't be going back out there again. I was passing through this small town, somewhere out in the countryside, just trying to make it to my next destination before midnight. I'd been driving a long time, and my eyes were starting to feel heavy, so when I spotted the lights from an old-looking pub on the side of the road, I figured I'd stop in for a quick drink, maybe something to wake me up a bit. The place looked like it had been there for years, crumbling brick, a wooden sign that swayed with every gust of wind. The windows were fogged up, but there was a glow coming from inside. I could hear faint laughter and the hum of conversation, so it felt safe enough. Just a little, cozy spot tucked out of the way. I pushed the door open, and every sound stopped. It was like someone hit mute on a TV. Every single person in that place turned to look at me. I felt this weird jolt go through me, like I was some animal caught in headlights. But then, one by one, they all started smiling. It wasn't unfriendly, more like they knew me, or thought they did. The bartender, a tall, older guy with gray hair slicked back, waved me over like he'd been expecting me. I wanted to turn around and leave, but it felt rude somehow. So I nodded, a bit stiffly, and walked over to the bar. "Evening, stranger," he said, grinning wide, almost too wide. "We've been waiting for you." "Sorry, I think you might have me mixed up with someone else," I said, trying to laugh it off. "I'm just passing through." The bartender chuckled, shaking his head. "No mistake. You're right on time." It was unsettling, but I figured he was just being friendly, so I ordered a drink. As I waited, I noticed a few people were still looking at me from their tables. They all wore these little smiles, watching me with this strange intensity. I looked down at my glass and took a sip, trying to ignore them, but their eyes never left me. I felt trapped under all that attention. When I nearly finished my drink, I nodded to the bartender and tried to stand, but before I could, a hand landed on my shoulder. I glanced up, and there was this woman, older, maybe in her 50s, with this dark red lipstick that was just a little smudged. "Don't be in such a hurry, dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Stay a while." "Yeah," another voice chimed in. I looked over and saw a man a few stools down, smiling at me with these eyes that looked far too excited. "You just got here. No need to leave so soon." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I shrugged their hands off, forcing a smile. "I really should get going." I have a long drive ahead. The bartender set another drink in front of me, though I hadn't ordered it. On the house, he said, giving me that same grin. Just stay a bit longer. No harm in that, is there? I looked around the room. Every person was staring at me now. I tried to stand again, but the older woman leaned over and whispered, "We don't get visitors here often. Especially not ones like you." The way she said that last part made my stomach twist. Ones like me? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly. Ones who fit. I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't want to know. I pulled out a few bills and set them on the bar, keeping my movements slow and calm. Thanks for the drink, but I really have to go. The bartender's smile faded just a little. His eyes narrowed, like he was calculating something. Leaving already? That's a shame. I backed toward the door, every instinct in me screaming that I needed to get out of there. Just as my hand reached the handle, the door swung shut, locking itself. My pulse spiked. What's going on? Just relax, the bartender said, his voice smooth and calm. No need to get worked up. You're safe here. The people around the tables began to stand up, slowly, almost in unison. They didn't say a word, just watched me, like they were waiting for something. I said I have to go, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. A man near the door shook his head, smiling that same awful smile. You can't leave yet. We've been waiting a long time for you. That was when it hit me. They weren't joking. They were serious. Every one of them seemed to think I was meant to be here, like I'd been part of some plan they'd been hatching. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, trapping me in that room. Look, I don't know what this is, but I'm leaving, I said, louder this time. My voice echoed in the quiet. The bartender sighed, almost like he was disappointed. It's not safe out there for someone like you, especially not tonight. The words were chilling, the way he said them. I felt a bead of sweat run down my neck. I'll take my chances. I tried to pull the door open again, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the lock click. I turned and saw the bartender holding a set of keys, twirling them around his finger with that smug look on his face. You're not going anywhere, he said. The people were getting closer now, moving in around me, blocking every possible way out. My mind raced, searching for some excuse, some way to get them to let me go. Please, I just stopped in for a drink. I didn't mean to intrude. Oh, you're not intruding, the older woman said, her voice almost sweet. This is exactly where you're supposed to be. I took a step back, feeling my heartbeat hammer in my ears. Why are you doing this? Like we said, the bartender replied, his smile never wavering. We've been waiting. I could feel the walls closing in, every face watching me with that unblinking stare, as if they'd already made up their minds about something. My pulse was racing, my breathing shallow. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy or rude anymore. I had to get out of there. I turned, pushing through the small crowd, shoving anyone in my way. I didn't care about the looks, the gasps, the disapproving whispers. I just needed to get to that door. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps closing in, but I pushed harder, slamming my shoulder into the door with all the strength I had. Somehow, it gave way, just enough for me to slip out. I stumbled into the night, nearly tripping over my own feet as I sprinted to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they were following. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw myself inside and locked it, jamming the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I finally looked up at the pub. They were all standing there in the doorway, watching me, those same blank, expectant smiles on every face. The bartender raised his hand, giving me this slow, almost friendly wave, like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. I hit the gas and tore out of that parking lot, my heart still pounding even as I got back on the highway. I didn't look back. I kept driving, even when the headlights of the pub faded in the distance. Every so often, though, I thought I could see that place out of the corner of my eye, still standing there, waiting. I don't know what they wanted from me, and I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing, I'll never stop at another small-town bar again. I've been working the night shift at a 24-hour laundromat for a while now. It's one of those places that's always open, no matter the time, no matter the day. It's quiet, mostly. The occasional person comes in to do their laundry late at night, but for the most part, it's just me cleaning and watching the clock crawl toward the end of my shift. I didn't mind it at first. The hours were long, but the job was easy enough. Just sweep the floors, wipe down the machines, and make sure everything was stocked and tidy for the next day. But after a few weeks, I started noticing him. The man who came in every single night, right around the same time. He wasn't like the usual customers who came in to actually do laundry. He'd walk in, look around like he was deciding which machine to use, but never put anything in. Not even a bag. He'd just sit in the back, near the corner by the vending machines, and stare at me. Just stare. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. I didn't want to jump to conclusions or make assumptions about anyone. Maybe he was just waiting for a friend. Maybe he was just passing through. But night after night, the same thing happened. He'd walk in, look around like he was deciding, then take a seat in that same corner, and just watch me. I'd be busy cleaning, pretending I didn't notice, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. The silence in the laundromat felt heavier with him there. The hum of the washers and dryers was louder than usual, like it was amplifying the tension. One night, around 2 in the morning, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I had to say something to him. I couldn't just keep looking over my shoulder and pretending I wasn't scared. He had been coming in for nearly a month, and I was starting to feel trapped. I walked over to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Excuse me, sir," I said. "You can't just sit here. If you're not going to do laundry, I'll have to ask you to leave." He didn't even look at me right away. He just kept staring ahead, like I wasn't even there. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I stood there, waiting for him to respond. After a few long moments, he slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were dark, almost hollow. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was seeing through me. "I know you," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I know where you live." I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I'd heard of people getting harassed before, but I never thought it would happen to me. I didn't know what to say. How could he know where I lived? I hadn't told anyone where I lived, not even my coworkers. I kept everything private, kept to myself. My heart started racing. My mind was going a million miles a minute, trying to figure out how he could have possibly known that. "How do you know where I live?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling despite myself. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was thin, almost like a smirk. He leaned back in his seat, the flickering light from the vending machines casting strange shadows across his face. "I've been watching you," he said, almost casually. "Every night. I know your routine. I know when you come in, and I know when you leave. I felt my stomach drop. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "You've been watching me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "For how long?" "Long enough," he replied, his smile widening. "Long enough to know everything about you." I took a step back, feeling the panic start to rise. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake. Maybe he was just trying to mess with me, get a reaction. But something in his eyes, something in the way he said those words, made it feel all too real. The walls of the laundromat felt like they were closing in around me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run. I wanted to call the police, but I was frozen, stuck in place. The silence between us stretched on, thick and suffocating. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't need to. His eyes told me everything. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying the fear he was causing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found my voice again. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice shaky but determined. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his gaze never wavering. Then, after what felt like 1,000 years, he slowly stood up. I took a step back, instinctively trying to put some distance between us. "I don't want anything," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I just like watching you. I like knowing where you are, where you'll be." The way he said it made my blood run cold. It was like he was savoring the moment, relishing the fear that was written all over my face. I don't know how long we stood there, just staring at each other. I could hear the hum of the machines, the distant sound of traffic outside, but it felt like everything had gone still, like time itself had stopped. Finally, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I watched him, too afraid to move, too afraid to take my eyes off of him. He reached the door and paused, looking over his shoulder one last time. "I'll see you tomorrow night," he said. And then, without another word, he stepped outside and disappeared into the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there after he left. I think I just stared at the door, too scared to do anything else. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the broom I had picked up at some point during the encounter. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should call the police, or if I should leave and never come back. But I stayed. I had to stay. I couldn't just leave, not without finishing my shift. So, I locked the door behind me, double-checked the security cameras, and kept working, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. The next night, he came back. Right on time, like always. This time, I didn't say anything. I didn't even look at him. I just kept my head down and tried to keep my hands from shaking. And every night after that, he came back. Sometimes he'd just sit there, not saying a word, just watching. Other times, he'd say something, something small, something that made my heart race. But I never confronted him again. I couldn't. I didn't know what he would do if I did. Eventually, I stopped showing up for the night shifts. I couldn't handle it anymore. I didn't want to be alone with him in that laundromat, with him knowing where I lived, watching me. I told my boss I had found another job, and that was that. I still don't know who he was, or why he chose me. But every time I close my eyes, I can see his face, and I hear his voice. "I'll see you tomorrow night." I was working the night shift at a small animal clinic, just me and the animals for hours on end. It was always dead quiet after 10 p.m., just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle from one of the kennels in the back. I didn't mind, though. I'd get paperwork done, prep for surgeries, make sure everything was stocked for the morning. Sometimes I'd even bring a book to pass the time if it was really slow. But then the calls started coming. It was late one night, just after midnight, and the clinic's phone rang. That wasn't unusual. We sometimes got emergency calls from people who didn't know where else to go. I picked up and said the usual, "This is Valley Animal Clinic, how can I help you?" But there was silence on the other end. Just dead air. I could hear faint breathing, or maybe it was static, I couldn't tell. I repeated myself, waited a few seconds, but then the call just ended. I figured maybe it was a prank or a wrong number. I let it go and went back to what I was doing. But then it happened again the next night. This time, though, I could hear a man's voice. He sounded strange, like he was out of breath, or maybe just tired. He said something about his dog, how it was hurt, needed help. I asked him to bring the dog in, told him I'd be waiting. There was a pause, like he was deciding what to do, and then he hung up without another word. I waited that night, but no one came. I stayed at the front desk for another hour, just in case, but there was nothing. No one came, and no one called back. The next night, it happened again. This time, he sounded more desperate. Said his dog was bleeding, that it was bad, that he needed help. I kept calm, told him to bring the dog in right away, that I'd be ready. I gave him directions, repeated them, but he didn't seem to hear me. He kept saying he was coming, that he was on his way. But just like before, he never showed. The calls kept coming every night, usually around the same time. The stories would change. Sometimes it was a cat, sometimes it was a rabbit. Once he even said he had an injured bird. I was starting to get frustrated. I told my manager, but she just brushed it off, said it was probably some lonely person who just wanted someone to talk to. I almost believed her, but something didn't sit right. The man's voice, the way he'd talk about these animals, it was like he was holding back, like there was something he wasn't telling me. Then, one night, the call came again, but this time, he said he was already outside. I felt a chill run down my spine. I went to the front door and looked out into the parking lot. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then I caught a figure standing by the streetlight, holding a small cage. He didn't move, just stood there, staring straight at me through the glass door. I waited a second, then opened the door a crack and called out to him, asking if he needed help. He didn't answer right away, just stood there like he hadn't even heard me. I was about to call out again when he finally stepped forward, carrying the cage in both hands like it was something precious. As he got closer, I could see his face better. He looked tired, bags under his eyes, skin pale under the harsh lights. He handed me the cage without saying anything, just shoved it into my hands. I looked down, expecting to see an animal inside, but the cage was empty. I looked back at him, confused, and asked him where the animal was. He didn't answer, just kept staring at me with this strange look, like he was waiting for me to do something. I asked him again, a bit firmer this time, where the animal was, if he'd brought it in another cage or maybe left it in his car. He shook his head slowly, like he didn't understand the question. Finally, he muttered something about how I wasn't supposed to see it yet, whatever that meant. I told him I couldn't help him if there was no animal, that he'd need to go home and bring it in. He didn't seem to hear me, though. He just kept looking at the cage, then at me, then back at the cage, like he was waiting for something to happen. Finally, I put the cage down and told him he needed to leave, that I couldn't help him. He didn't react, just stared at me, unblinking. I was about to call for backup, but then he turned and walked away, leaving the empty cage on the counter. I locked the door behind him and watched as he disappeared into the darkness. The cage was still sitting there, empty and cold, like some strange reminder of what had just happened. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that cage, the way he'd handed it to me, the look in his eyes. The next morning, I told my manager again, told her everything this time. She said she'd look into it, maybe call the cops if he showed up again. But days went by, and I didn't hear anything more. No calls, no strange men at the door, nothing. I thought maybe it was over, that he'd finally decided to leave me alone. But then, a week later, I came in for my shift, and the cage was back, sitting on the counter, right where he'd left it. This time, though, there was something inside, a single scrap of paper, folded up and tucked into the corner. I picked it up, unfolded it, and there, in messy handwriting, was my name. The trip to Denali National Park had been a long time coming. I had wanted to see the vast wilderness, the towering mountains, and the sprawling landscapes. The plan was simple. I would hike solo, find some good spots, and soak in the beauty of nature. I had my gear packed, and I felt prepared for the adventure. The first few days went well. I followed the trails, set up my tent in the evenings, and enjoyed the crisp air. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made me feel small in the best way. I took pictures of the scenery, smiled at the occasional squirrel, and felt happy just being there. On the fourth day, I returned to my campsite after a long hike. I was tired but content. As I opened my tent, I immediately noticed something was off. My gear looked different, like someone had been messing around with it. My first aid kit was not where I left it. I searched through my things, and it hit me. My water filter was gone. I had made sure it was packed tight before I left. How could it just vanish? I felt uneasy, a knot forming in my stomach. I knew it was just me out here, so how could this happen? I scanned the area around my tent but saw no signs of anyone. Maybe I had misplaced it. Maybe I was just tired. I pushed the nagging feeling aside and decided to go to a nearby trailhead, hoping some fresh air would clear my mind. I started down the path when I saw a figure in the distance. He was a fellow hiker, moving in my direction. He had a well-worn backpack and looked like he had been on the trails for some time. He waved as he got closer. "Hey there," he called out. "Nice day for a hike, isn't it?" "Yeah, it is," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just enjoying the scenery." We chatted for a few minutes, and he told me about some great spots to check out in the park. He seemed friendly enough, so I decided to share my little mishap with my gear. "I think someone tampered with my stuff at camp. My water filter is missing, and I'm not sure what to do." His expression changed for a moment. It was subtle but noticeable, like he was weighing his next words. "I can help with that," he said, his voice smooth. "I have a spare water filter if you need it." I hesitated. It seemed too convenient. "Really? You have a spare?" "Absolutely," he replied, pulling his backpack closer. "I come prepared. Let me show you." I followed him a little ways down the trail until we reached a small clearing where he set down his pack. He opened it and pulled out a shiny, new water filter. "Here you go. This will do the trick." I took it, unsure. "Thanks, but this seems like a big favor for just meeting." He laughed lightly, as if my concern was amusing. "I always carry extras. You never know when you might need something in the wild. You'll be glad you have it." Something in his tone set off alarms in my head. I tried to shake off the unease and told myself he was just being nice. But the knot in my stomach tightened. I thought about my other gear, how it had been moved around, and wondered if he had something to do with it. After some small talk, I decided to excuse myself and head back to camp. I really appreciate this, I said, holding up the filter again. But I should get going. I need to set up before it gets dark. No problem at all. Just remember, if you need anything else, I'll be around, he replied with a smile. But it didn't feel genuine. As I made my way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. I finally arrived at my campsite, the air thick with tension. I went inside my tent, clutching the water filter tightly, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I unpacked my gear, rearranging everything to make sure nothing else was missing. But then I noticed something. My first aid kit had been opened. The supplies inside were scattered, not just moved. It was as if someone had been searching for something. I felt my heart race as the reality sank in. Someone had been tampering with my gear. I looked outside but saw no sign of the other hiker. I forced myself to breathe deeply, reminding myself that I had not seen him again. I tried to focus on my surroundings, the sounds of nature settling me a bit. But it did not last long. As night fell, the anxiety returned. I decided to pack everything up and leave my campsite, moving to a more populated area in the park. I figured the trails near the visitor center would be safer. I took one last look around to ensure I had everything, and as I zipped up my bag, I felt a presence behind me. Turning around, I was met with the same hiker, standing a few feet away. "Hey, thought I might find you here," he called out, his smile wide, too wide. Yeah. Just getting ready to head out," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why would you leave? The night is so beautiful. You should stay." "You can't miss the stars," he said, taking a step closer. "No, I think I need to go. I don't want to hike in the dark." He raised an eyebrow. "You really think you'll be safe out there? What if someone else finds you?" That line sent a chill through me. "I'll be fine," I said, forcing myself to move past him. I could feel my heart racing, fear pushing me forward. As I walked away, I could hear him behind me, still talking, but I didn't look back. I picked up my pace, moving toward the main trail, and then I heard it, the sound of his footsteps following. He was still behind me. The panic surged as I picked up my pace even more, my mind racing with what to do. I could not let him catch up. I didn't want to think about what he might do if he did. I came to a fork in the trail and quickly chose the left path. I had no idea where it would lead me, but it felt like my only chance. I heard him call out, "Hey, wait up." His tone was casual, but I could sense the urgency behind it. I ran, the trail uneven beneath my feet, my breath coming in quick bursts. I didn't stop until I reached a clearing where I saw a group of people gathered around a fire. Relief flooded over me. I stumbled into the group, breathless and shaken. The hikers looked at me, surprised by my sudden appearance. I turned back, and I saw the man at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He stood still, hands at his sides, but I could see the irritation on his face. "Everything okay?" one of the hikers asked, noticing my panic. "Yes," I managed to say. I got turned around. The man in the clearing offered me a spot by the fire, and I quickly took it, staying close to the warmth. I kept glancing back toward the edge of the light, but the hiker was gone. The group was friendly, and they offered me food and water. I told them a little about my trip, but I left out the part about the man. I didn't want to alarm anyone. As night fell and the stars came out, I sat with the group, feeling safe, surrounded by others. Eventually, I excused myself to set up my tent nearby. I could still hear the laughter and chatter from the fire, but I felt the weight of the day wash over me. As I lay down, exhaustion took over, and sleep came easily. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to leave the campsite. I needed to feel secure, surrounded by other hikers. I left no trace behind, hoping to forget the incident. But the memory of that man lingered in my mind. Denali had offered so much beauty, but it also reminded me to be careful. I learned that some encounters could change your perception of the world around you. I continued my hike, feeling a little stronger, but always looking over my shoulder. I never saw the man again, and I hoped I never would. I'd rented this cabin up in the mountains, way off the main road, just to get some peace and quiet. I'd been working non-stop for months, and my head felt like it was on fire, so I thought a week alone in the woods might help. It was a small place, barely big enough for one person, but it had what I needed: bed, little kitchen, bathroom, a porch out front where I could sit and breathe fresh air. The rental company assured me it was a safe area, hardly any people around, just hikers every now and then. Perfect, I thought. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first day was as normal as I could have hoped. I unloaded my bags, set up some of my stuff, and spent the day just unwinding. I made myself a meal, read a book, and went to bed early. The quiet was so thick, I thought I'd have trouble sleeping, but I was out within minutes. Woke up feeling better than I had in months. But when I opened the door that morning, there was something sitting on the porch. It was a wallet. Just sitting there, dead center in front of the door, like someone had placed it there on purpose. I picked it up, thinking maybe someone had dropped it, but then I realized there was no reason anyone should have been near the cabin. There weren't any other cabins close by. I opened the wallet, and it was full of cards, a driver's license, even a few bills. The ID was some guy I didn't know, someone named Mark. He had an address a few towns over, not anywhere close to where I was. I figured maybe he'd lost it somehow, and someone found it and left it here by mistake, thinking he was staying at the cabin. Or maybe a hiker dropped it nearby, and it got blown up here by the wind. I didn't know, but I set it on the edge of the porch, planning to bring it back with me when I went to town later. The day went by as usual. I hiked a bit, read some more, and by evening, I'd forgotten about the wallet. The second night, I slept even better. No weird dreams, no sounds, just solid sleep. But the next morning, I opened the door, and there was something else sitting there. This time, it was a set of keys. I'm talking a whole ring of them, at least a dozen, with a few keychains, one of those big plastic ones like a little kid might have, shaped like a dinosaur. And just like the wallet, they were right in the middle of the porch, almost like someone was trying to make sure I'd see them. I felt a chill that time. It didn't make any sense. I thought maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe there were people camping nearby, pulling a prank. I checked around the cabin, even walked a bit down the road, but I didn't see anyone. No cars, no tents, nothing. I took the keys and put them next to the wallet on the porch, then tried to ignore it, but it was hard to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I kept hearing sounds. Little creaks and knocks. It's an old cabin, so I tried telling myself it was just settling noises, maybe a branch brushing against the side. But every few minutes, I'd hear it again, like someone tapping, a little too regular to be random. I barely slept, kept looking out the window, checking the lock on the door, trying to catch a glimpse of anyone nearby. But it was dark, and there was no sign of anyone around. In the morning, I opened the door, dreading what I'd find. And there it was, a cell phone. An old, beat-up one, lying there like the wallet and the keys, right in the middle of the porch. I picked it up, almost out of reflex, and it was cold. It didn't turn on, probably dead for a while. The screen was cracked, and the back had scratches all over it, like it had been dropped or scraped against something. I set it next to the wallet and keys, feeling my stomach twist. I didn't want to go out there and explore anymore. I just wanted to stay inside, where I felt at least a little safe. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself it was silly, that I was overreacting. So I stayed, even though every part of me wanted to get in the car and head back to town. I tried reading again, tried to focus, but the whole day, I kept glancing at the door, listening for any sounds. It felt like something was watching me, just outside, waiting. That night, the noises came back, louder this time. I heard scratching, not like an animal but like metal on wood, like someone dragging something along the porch. I sat there in bed, wide awake, clutching my phone, waiting for it to stop. Eventually, it did, but by then, it was almost dawn, and I hadn't slept a single second. When the sun finally came up, I went to the door, heart pounding, and opened it. And there, sitting right on the middle of the porch, was a single shoe. A worn-out, muddy sneaker, like someone had been hiking in it. I didn't even touch it. Just stared at it, feeling sick to my stomach. I knew then that it wasn't a coincidence, wasn't just some lost items getting blown up by the wind. Someone was leaving them there, someone who knew I was here, and knew I'd find them. I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up my things, threw everything into my bag without even bothering to fold or organize it, and headed straight to the car. But as I got in, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footsteps in the dirt, fresh ones, leading from the woods to the porch. They weren't there the day before, and they didn't belong to me. I didn't look back. I drove straight to town, heart racing, and went right to the rental office. I told them what had happened, about the items, the sounds, the footsteps. The woman at the desk looked at me like I was crazy, said no one else was renting cabins nearby, and they hadn't heard of anything strange happening up there. But I knew what I'd seen, knew it wasn't just my imagination. I handed her the wallet, the keys, and the cell phone. She took them, looking confused, and said she'd check if anyone had reported missing items, but I didn't care at that point. I just wanted to get out of there, put as much distance between me and that cabin as I could. Even now, I still think about it. About the way those things were left, just waiting for me each morning. How someone had been out there, close enough to the cabin to leave them and watch me find them. I was driving through the desert late at night. It was one of those long stretches of road that felt like it went on forever. No lights, no towns, just emptiness. I had been on the road for hours, trying to get to a motel before it got too late. The air was still and heavy, the kind of silence that made everything around feel even more isolated. I was halfway through a stretch of highway with nothing but sand and darkness on either side. The radio was just static, so I had turned it off a while back, leaving only the hum of the engine and the faint sound of the tires on the road to keep me company. It felt peaceful at first, but after a while, the loneliness of the road started to creep in. There wasn't another car in sight for miles, and I started to feel that strange kind of unease that comes with being completely alone. That was when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was probably just someone else traveling late like me. But the truck didn't pass. It stayed behind me, close enough that I could see the shape of it in the dark. I sped up a little, just to see if they'd go around, but they didn't. They kept the same distance, right behind me. I started to feel uneasy. I slowed down again, just a little, and the truck slowed down too. That was when I really started to get nervous. It was one thing for someone to follow close for a few minutes, but this was different. Whoever was driving wasn't trying to pass. They were just staying there, in the dark, keeping the same pace. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, trying to make out who was behind the wheel, but the lights from the truck were too bright. All I could see was the outline of the truck's front, big and heavy, almost like a shadow. I started to feel a knot in my stomach, and my mind raced with thoughts I tried to push away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the driver just didn't want to pass because the road was too narrow. But I knew something was off. After another mile or so, I decided to pull over and let them pass. There was no reason for them to stay behind me like that. I put my blinker on, slowing down and easing onto the shoulder. I expected the truck to fly past me as soon as I got out of the way, but it didn't. It stopped. The truck just sat there on the road behind me, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I waited, my heart beating fast in my chest. Why wasn't it moving? I thought maybe they had car trouble, or maybe they were going to pull over too, but no one got out. The truck just idled there, the engine low and rumbling, waiting like I was. I sat there for a minute, staring into the mirror, trying to figure out what to do. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My first thought was to get out, confront whoever was behind me, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't normal. This wasn't normal. I decided to get back on the road, hoping the truck would just leave me alone if I kept driving. I put the car in drive, my foot heavy on the gas, and merged back onto the highway. I didn't look back at first, too focused on trying to put as much distance between me and that truck as possible. But after a minute, I glanced in the mirror. The truck was still there. I felt the panic rising in my chest. No matter how fast I went, the truck kept pace with me, its headlights looming closer. It wasn't about getting around me anymore. They were following me. I pressed the gas harder, my car speeding down the empty road, the speedometer climbing. The truck stayed right behind me, not letting up. I could hear the engine growling in the distance, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone on this road anymore. I started to scan the road for an exit, a rest stop, anything where I could pull off and maybe find someone. But there was nothing. Just more empty highway and desert, no signs, no lights. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call for help, no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Then, the truck did something that made my blood run cold. It swerved toward me, just enough to make my car shake from the air pressure, like it was trying to run me off the road. I swerved back into my lane, my heart pounding. I realized then that this wasn't an accident. They were playing a game with me. I glanced back at the truck, trying to see the driver again, but all I could make out was a figure, a dark silhouette behind the wheel, still grinning its headlights at me like some kind of predator. They sped up, pulling closer, the front of the truck practically touching my bumper now. My mind raced with ways to get out of this. If I pulled over again, they'd just stop too. If I sped up, they'd match my speed. I was trapped, with no one else around, just me and this stranger. I tried slowing down, hoping maybe they'd get bored, but it only seemed to make them angrier. The truck honked loudly, blaring through the still night, and swerved again, closer this time. My car jolted to the side, tires skidding for a second before I got control again. They weren't just playing anymore. They were trying to push me off the road. I pushed the gas pedal down as far as it would go, my car roaring down the road. I couldn't think straight. I just needed to get away. But the truck was relentless. It followed me, matching my speed, keeping just close enough to remind me they were there, in control. The road ahead stretched out endlessly. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. My car wasn't built for speed, and I could feel it starting to strain under the pressure. The truck, though, didn't seem to have any trouble keeping up. I spotted something up ahead, a turnoff, just a small dirt road leading off into the desert. I didn't have time to think about it. I swerved onto it, my tires kicking up dust as I veered off the main road. I hoped maybe the truck wouldn't follow, that they'd stick to the highway. But no! I heard the roar of the engine behind me, louder now as the truck barreled onto the dirt road after me. I drove blindly, the dust clouding my vision. I couldn't see anything but the headlights in the rearview mirror. The road was rough, the car bouncing and rattling as I sped through the desert. The truck was getting closer again. I could feel it. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The road ahead was getting rougher, the car shaking violently with each bump. And then, out of nowhere, the road just ended. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt in the dirt. I looked up, my heart pounding, and saw a cliff just a few feet ahead. The truck stopped too, just a few yards behind me. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the ticking of my engine, cooling down from the strain. The truck's headlights bathed my car in an eerie glow, and I could see the silhouette of the driver inside, still watching me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was trapped, nowhere to go but over the edge. The driver seemed to know that. They just sat there, waiting, like they were enjoying the moment. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with panic. I couldn't just sit there, but I couldn't drive forward either. I was stuck. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the truck's engine revved again. I braced myself, expecting them to ram me over the edge, but instead, they just reversed. Slowly, they backed away, the headlights growing dimmer as they disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, too scared to move, too scared to believe it was over. I waited until the dust had settled, until the silence of the desert returned. Finally, I turned the car around and drove back to the main road, my heart still racing, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't see the truck again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere in the dark, watching me, waiting for their next game. I was at the train station late one night, around 11:30. I remember the time because I kept looking at my watch, hoping the train would just get here already. The station was completely empty. Not a single person around except for me. It was cold, and the kind of silence that settles in the middle of the night made it worse somehow. The lights above flickered a bit, but that's normal for a place like this. I was standing on the platform, waiting for the last train. I had to work late, and by the time I got to the station, all the buses had stopped running. I didn't have much of a choice. I'd taken the late train before, and nothing ever happened. It's always empty, just a few people minding their own business. I paced back and forth, checking the time on my phone, hoping it wouldn't get delayed. I looked down the platform and noticed someone standing there, at the far end, just barely in the light. I hadn't heard them come up. They were just there. I figured it was just another person waiting for the train, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The figure was facing me, but they weren't moving. Just standing still, staring. I couldn't make out any details because of the distance, but I could feel their eyes on me. The platform stretched out in both directions, with no real way to go except forward or back toward the station entrance. And that person was at the far end, blocking one way. I thought about walking back to the entrance, but it would have meant turning my back to them, and something about that made me uncomfortable. So I stayed where I was, trying not to look directly at them, but it was hard not to. My heart started racing a little, though I tried to tell myself it was nothing. They were probably just waiting for the train like I was. A few minutes passed, maybe longer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked again, and that person was still there, hadn't moved an inch. Not one step. I could have sworn they were closer now, though. Like they'd shifted just slightly. I wasn't sure. I pulled my phone out, pretending to scroll through it, but my eyes kept flicking back to the figure. The train wasn't due for another 5 minutes. 5 minutes felt like forever at that moment. I told myself to relax, to just keep cool and wait it out. People wait for trains, that's what they do, I thought. No big deal. But then the figure started to move. At first, it was just a step. Slow, deliberate. Then another step. They were walking toward me, not fast but steady. I froze, not knowing what to do. There was no one else on the platform, just me and this person. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just coming closer for the train. Maybe they wanted to ask for the time. But they didn't stop. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my hands starting to sweat. I glanced behind me, toward the exit, but it was a long way back. I was too far down the platform. The figure kept coming, their steps quickening. Panic hit me then, hard. I could see the shape of him now, a man, tall, with broad shoulders. I couldn't see his face clearly under the flickering lights, but I could feel his eyes locked on me. He started moving faster, his pace picking up until he was practically jogging. That's when I knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't just some guy walking toward the train. This guy was coming for me. I backed up, looking for anywhere to go, anywhere to hide, but the platform was wide open. I was exposed, nowhere to go except the edge of the tracks. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear my blood rushing in my ears. The only thing between me and him was the empty space of the platform, and he was closing the gap fast. I looked down the track, hoping to see the train lights, praying for them to appear, but the tunnel was dark. No sign of the train. I didn't have time to think anymore. He was running now, full on sprinting toward me, his feet pounding against the concrete. I could hear it, each step getting louder and louder. I took a step back, my legs stiff with fear. Then I turned and ran, but there was nowhere to go. I couldn't make it to the exit in time. He'd catch me before I got halfway there. My only chance was to jump down onto the tracks and try to cross to the other platform. It was risky, but it was all I could think of. I reached the edge of the platform and looked down. The tracks were deeper than they seemed, and I hesitated for just a second, but that second cost me. I heard him behind me, getting closer. His footsteps were right there. I could feel him almost breathing down my neck. I jumped. The fall wasn't graceful. I hit the gravel hard, stumbling as I landed, but I managed to stay on my feet. I could hear him above me now, shouting something I couldn't make out, his voice hoarse and angry. He was right there, at the edge of the platform, looking down at me. I didn't look up at his face, didn't want to see it. I ran along the tracks, my legs burning, the cold air cutting through me. My shoes slipped on the metal rails, and I almost fell. I could hear him drop down onto the tracks behind me. He was following me, not stopping, not giving up. His footsteps were heavy, crunching the gravel under his weight. I could see the lights of the train now, far down the tunnel, but it was coming. Relief washed over me, but I wasn't safe yet. The train was still a ways off, and I was stuck on the tracks. I had to get off before it reached me. I scrambled to the opposite platform, trying to climb back up. My hands slipped on the cold concrete, and I couldn't get a good grip. My fingers were numb, shaking. I felt the man's presence behind me, getting closer. He wasn't running anymore, just walking toward me, slow, like he had all the time in the world. Like he knew I couldn't get away. I forced myself up, pulling with everything I had, and finally managed to get back onto the platform. My knees hit the concrete hard, but I didn't stop. I got up and ran toward the exit, not looking back. The train was pulling in as I reached the stairs. I heard it screeching to a stop, the doors opening, the rush of air as it slowed down. I kept running, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't stop until I was back at the station entrance, where there were lights, and people, and safety. I don't know if he followed me all the way. I don't know if he got on the train. I didn't look back. But I never took the late-night train again. It was supposed to be a break from everything: work, people, noise. Just me, alone in a small cabin tucked away deep in the woods. I'd saved up to get it for the week, just to be somewhere quiet, with nothing but the trees and my own thoughts. There was a dirt path winding through the forest to get here, and I'd barely seen another car since I turned off the main road. Just that tiny cabin and miles of trees in every direction. It was perfect. Or it should have been. My first day went exactly how I wanted. I didn't have my phone on, no connection to anything but nature. I spent hours walking the trails around the cabin, just breathing, letting myself unwind. When it got dark, I built a small fire, ate a simple dinner I'd brought, and went to bed, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. The next morning, though, things felt different. When I opened the cabin door, there was a note on the porch, just sitting there on the wood. A folded sheet of plain white paper. I picked it up, a little surprised but mostly confused. I hadn't told anyone where I was staying, and I hadn't seen anyone since I'd arrived. I opened it, and my stomach dropped. The note was short, only one sentence: "I saw you sitting by the fire." That was it. No name, no signature, nothing. I stood there, staring at the words for what felt like minutes, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe someone had passed by, maybe a hiker? But it didn't make sense. I was miles from any trail, and the place was so remote I couldn't imagine anyone just happening to come by. I tried to shake it off. It was probably a prank, someone just messing around. But it left a sour feeling in my stomach the rest of the day. I couldn't fully relax, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, expecting to see someone, anyone out there. But there was nothing. Just the quiet trees swaying in the wind. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I forced myself to stay calm, to remind myself that I was safe, alone. But when morning came, there was another note, waiting for me on the porch. This one was worse. "I watched you check the locks last night." My hands shook as I read it. There was no way anyone should have known what I'd done after dark, not unless they'd been close. Very close. I looked around, scanning the trees, but it was the same empty forest I'd been in all week. I tried to convince myself it was still some weird prank, but my mind kept coming back to the same question: who could have done this? The forest felt different after that, too silent, almost too close. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, trying to look for any sign of someone: footprints, broken branches, anything that would tell me someone had been there. But there was nothing. Just leaves and dirt, undisturbed. I thought about leaving that night, but I forced myself to stay. It was just a few more days, and I didn't want to give in to some strange prank. But every sound that night, every creak, every rustle outside, had me jumping out of my skin. I barely slept. The next morning, I was almost too scared to open the door. But I did, and there it was again, another note, just lying there like it was waiting for me. You didn't sleep well, did you? I felt like my blood turned to ice. Whoever this was, they knew everything I was doing, almost as if they were inside the cabin with me. I started to wonder if maybe they had been, at least at some point. The cabin wasn't exactly secure, just a couple of simple locks and old windows. And I'd been asleep, completely unaware, alone in the middle of nowhere. I felt trapped, my mind racing with options. I could leave, get in the car and drive off, but there was no guarantee whoever this was wouldn't just follow me, or that they weren't already planning to show up somewhere else. By now, I felt sick, barely able to eat or even think clearly. I spent the day by the windows, keeping watch, expecting to see someone at any moment. But the woods were still, empty, and it started to feel like the silence was taunting me. It was like I was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. That night, I barely turned out the lights. I sat up, watching the door, the windows, everything. I tried to stay awake, convinced I'd see someone trying to get in, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. When I opened the door the next morning, I was already numb, dreading what I knew would be there. And it was a fourth note, lying there, folded neatly on the porch. You look tired. My hands were trembling as I read it. This wasn't just someone playing around, this was something else. This was personal. Someone knew me, watched me, and was getting closer, bit by bit, each day. I could feel it. And they wanted me to know it, too. I felt it in the way they wrote, in how they left the notes exactly where I'd see them. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't pack, I didn't even stop to think. I just grabbed my car keys, barely stopping to lock the door behind me, and left. I drove down that winding road as fast as I could, my heart pounding the whole way. I didn't care if I left anything behind, didn't care about anything but getting away from that place, away from those woods and those notes. It wasn't until I was halfway down the main road that I started to breathe again, my hands finally relaxing on the wheel. I drove straight home, barely stopping, not daring to look back in case I'd see someone standing there, watching me leave. A part of me felt like I was being paranoid, like maybe it really was a prank, but something deep down told me it wasn't. I never went back to that cabin, never even told anyone the full story. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I still feel like I'm being watched. Like maybe I left something behind in that forest, something that's still following me, even now. I'd been hiking Mount Rainier alone, just taking a few days to clear my head. It wasn't peak season, so it was quieter, not packed like it gets in summer. I started the trail early in the morning, hoping to be alone with my thoughts. The first couple of hours were peaceful, just me, the trees, and the crunch of gravel under my boots. Around midday, I stopped to get some water and check my map, and that's when I noticed someone up ahead, a little down the path. A man, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled down low. He was just standing there, facing away from me, and I didn't think much of it. It's normal to pass people, even in the off-season, and he seemed like any other hiker. I set off again, kept to my own pace, and after maybe 20 minutes, I stopped to adjust my pack. That's when I noticed him again, this time behind me, farther back, but on the same trail. I brushed it off as coincidence. Maybe he was going at a slower pace or had taken a break somewhere along the way. I kept walking, but I felt myself getting a little more aware, checking back every so often. The third time I saw him, it was after another mile or so. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, at about the same distance. He was just standing there, like he'd stopped to take in the view, but it felt off. His head was turned a bit in my direction, and I felt the hairs on my neck go up. It was weird, and the way he just froze whenever I looked back at him started to feel deliberate. I sped up, putting more distance between us, and thought maybe I'd lose him. I even tried going off trail for a little, but the terrain was tough, and I didn't want to get lost or hurt myself. So I got back onto the main path, feeling a little stupid but telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. After all, people take breaks, slow down, look at scenery. It didn't mean he was following me. But each time I stopped or looked around, he was still there. And every time I caught sight of him, he was in some kind of pose, like he'd paused mid-action, pretending to check his pack or read his map. But his body was always turned slightly toward me. And every time I looked, he'd quickly look down or shift like he hadn't noticed me. I picked up my pace again, hoping to reach the lookout point where there'd likely be other people. After a while, I started to feel a little better, thinking I'd managed to lose him. But I kept looking back, unable to shake the feeling. That's when I saw him again. He kept up, and he was closer than before. He was facing away from me, leaning over a rock like he was tying his shoe, but I could feel his attention on me, the way his head angled slightly, like he was just waiting for me to look. I didn't want him to know I was scared, so I took my phone out, pretended to be checking something, acting casual. I took a quick photo of the path ahead and pretended to be focused on that, but my mind was racing. Should I confront him? I didn't know what I'd say, and I didn't want to get into any kind of fight out there with no one else around. I kept moving, glancing back less and less, just trying to ignore it. But I could feel him there, and every now and then, I'd hear a faint crunch of gravel somewhere behind me, like he was just a few paces back. Every time I turned, though, he'd stop, just standing still like he'd been frozen mid-step, never catching up, but never getting any farther away either. It was starting to get late, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I was regretting not bringing more supplies with me. I pushed myself faster, practically jogging, desperate to reach the end of the trail or at least a spot where I'd have cell service. I tried dialing out, but there was no signal. Finally, I saw the end of the trailhead up ahead. My car was parked just a little ways beyond, and relief washed over me. I glanced back one last time, hoping he'd be gone. But there he was, frozen again, a good distance behind but still close enough that I could make out the outline of his cap and jacket. I forced myself not to run. I didn't want to seem afraid. I walked briskly to my car, got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I waited a few moments, watching the trail entrance in my rearview mirror. Part of me was hoping he wouldn't come out, that maybe I'd overreacted and made something out of nothing. But then I saw him, standing there at the edge of the trail, watching my car. He didn't move, he just stood there, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. I took a breath, put the car into gear, and pulled out of the lot, keeping my eyes on him in the mirror. As I drove away, I saw him step back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I was on the night shift, alone at this gas station out by the highway. Quiet place. Middle of nowhere, nothing much except the long road stretching out and a couple of dim lights over the parking lot. Most nights, I'd barely see a car for hours. Just me, the flickering overhead lights, and the low hum of the refrigerators in the back. It was one of those nights, dead quiet. I'd finished stocking shelves, and it was only 1 a.m., so I still had a long shift ahead. I was wiping down the counters, making sure the coffee machine was clean, doing little things to pass the time. When I went to wipe down the windows, I noticed there was something scrawled across one of them. Just a smudge at first glance, but I leaned in closer, and it was clear as day. Someone had written, "Hello." I was a little freaked, to be honest. I hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen a car pull up. It was quiet outside, and the air felt heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. I brushed it off, wiped the word away, and went back behind the counter. I tried to convince myself it was some prank. I figured maybe some kid had done it before I'd come in and I just hadn't noticed. But then, maybe half an hour later, I turned around to grab a drink from the fridge, and when I looked back at the windows, there was another message. This time, it was longer, scrawled right across the glass in big, messy letters. "Why did you erase me?" I felt this chill crawl up my spine. My hands were shaking as I walked up to the window, looking out into the empty parking lot. Nothing but shadows and the dim outline of trees in the distance. I squinted, trying to see if anyone was out there, but I couldn't make anything out. I grabbed a rag and wiped the message off, feeling like I was being watched. I checked the security camera feed to see if anyone had come near the window, but there was nothing. Just me in the store, no sign of anyone outside. I started getting paranoid, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, feeling like someone was standing just out of sight. I went about my tasks, trying to ignore the feeling. But every time I turned my back for a few minutes, there'd be another message waiting for me. Each time, it felt like it got more personal. "I can see you. Don't look away." It was getting under my skin. I checked the cameras again, rewinding to see if I'd missed something. Finally, I noticed something strange in the footage. There was a gap, just a few seconds of static where the camera had gone dark. Right after that, the message would appear on the glass. Like someone was sneaking up to the window while the camera was out, writing their messages, and then disappearing before the feed returned. I started watching the windows like a hawk, but I couldn't catch anyone in the act. Every time I glanced away, just for a second, another message would appear. I started getting angry, trying to call out, telling whoever was out there to knock it off, but my voice just echoed back at me. Then came the message that made my blood run cold. In messy, smudged letters, it said, "Check the camera. You'll see me." I went straight back to the monitor, heart pounding. I rewound the feed, and at first, it looked like nothing was there. Just the empty parking lot, the store, and me standing alone inside. But as I kept watching, I caught a flash of movement near the bottom of the screen. I zoomed in, squinting, and saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a figure crawling along the ground, just low enough to avoid the camera's main view. I couldn't see much, just the shape of a person on their hands and knees, scuttling close to the wall, sneaking right up to the window. They'd reach up with a hand, swipe their fingers across the glass to leave a message, then drop back down and crawl away. I was shaking as I watched. Whoever they were, they'd been crawling just out of sight all night, coming up to the windows whenever I turned my back. It was the worst feeling I'd ever had, knowing they were that close, creeping up without making a sound, just watching and waiting for me to look away. I wanted to call someone, but there was no one around. I'd be lucky if anyone even passed by this gas station before dawn. So I decided to confront them. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter, stepped outside, and called out. My voice sounded small, barely carrying in the heavy air. "Whoever's out here, just show yourself." I yelled. My voice echoed out, swallowed by the trees. No answer. I scanned the area with the flashlight, swinging the beam across the parking lot, up along the side of the building. Nothing. I stepped around the back of the store, looking between the trees, my heart racing. Just when I was about to give up, I heard something. It was a faint rustling sound, like fabric against the ground, coming from somewhere nearby. I swung my flashlight around, catching a glimpse of movement behind the dumpster. My hands were sweaty, but I forced myself to step closer. When I finally rounded the corner, I saw them. A man, crouched low, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight. He was grinning at me, this wide, unsettling grin that didn't look right. His eyes were wild, locked onto mine, and he didn't say a word. I shouted at him, telling him to leave, to get away from the property. But he just stayed crouched there, grinning. His hands were filthy, dirt caked under his nails, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Finally, he moved. Slowly, he reached up and traced something in the dirt on the ground between us, his eyes never leaving mine. I stepped back, my skin crawling, and without a word, he stood up and disappeared into the dark. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me, trying to shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. I didn't dare look at the windows again, didn't want to see if he'd left another message. I just sat behind the counter, waiting for my shift to end, my heart pounding with every creak and rustle outside. By the time my replacement arrived, I was out of there before he could ask any questions. I didn't even look back as I got in my car and drove off, leaving the gas station and it's empty, staring windows far behind. I worked the night shift at a factory on the edge of town. It was always dead quiet, just the hum of machines and the echo of metal clanking in the distance. I worked with a few other guys, but we were spread out across different sections of the building, so I rarely saw anyone except in passing. The place was massive, mostly dimly lit, and had long, shadowy hallways. The kind of place where sounds traveled, sometimes making it hard to tell if you were alone or not. One night, I was on my usual rounds, doing routine checks on the machinery in the far corner of the factory. I didn't see or hear anything strange at first. I was used to the flickering lights and the occasional groaning sound from the old machines. But I felt something that night. I couldn't explain it, but it was like I was being watched. Every time I turned my back, I felt this prickling on my neck, like eyes were on me. I shrugged it off at first, kept telling myself it was just nerves. It was easy to get jumpy working night shifts in a place like that. But when I walked by one of the big industrial machines, something caught my eye. There was a shadow, something low to the ground, almost like someone crouching. I stopped, leaned a little closer to make sure I wasn't seeing things. Then the shadow moved. I took a step back, my pulse jumping. It was just enough light to see a figure ducking back behind the machine, as if they were trying to stay hidden. My heart started pounding as I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. I felt a rush of anger, trying to push down the fear. It was probably one of my coworkers trying to mess with me. Maybe John. He liked pulling pranks, but he usually kept it harmless. I wasn't in the mood for his games that night, though. I called out his name, louder this time. "John. If that's you, knock it off." Nothing. Just the low hum of the machines and that faint echo in the distance. I stayed where I was, waiting, staring at that dark spot where I'd seen the figure. After a minute, I started walking again, feeling tense, my ears tuned to every little sound around me. I tried to brush it off, but it kept gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling someone was following me around. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, and once or twice, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But every time I turned, there was no one there. Later in the shift, I finally ran into John in one of the hallways. He looked normal, just carrying some tools, but I still had a weird feeling. I asked him straight up if he'd been hiding behind the machines earlier. He just stared at me, almost too blankly, then laughed it off, saying he had no idea what I was talking about. His laugh was hollow, not the usual kind of laugh he'd give. That threw me off. Something about the way he looked at me then, it was off. Like he wasn't really looking at me, but past me. I laughed it off too, shrugged, and went on with my shift. But after that, things got weirder. I'd be checking one of the machines, and then, just as I'd start to get into a rhythm, I'd look up and catch John's face peeking out from behind one of the other machines, his head just barely visible. He'd be half hidden, and the moment I'd see him, he'd move away, ducking out of sight before I could say anything. It started happening again and again, every hour or so. I'd see him, just out of the corner of my eye, always half hidden behind something, just watching me. And every time, he'd disappear when I tried to confront him. I finally decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I caught up with him in the break room, just him and me. He was standing by the coffee machine, his back turned. I called his name, trying to keep my voice steady, but he didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I took a step closer and called his name again, louder this time. Slowly, he turned around, and there was something in his eyes, something that made me feel like I was staring at a stranger. His face was blank, no expression, just empty. It was like he didn't even recognize me for a second. Then he blinked, and a small smile appeared, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's up?" I tried to keep my cool, asked him directly why he kept following me around, hiding behind things, watching me. He tilted his head, like he was confused, then shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about, man," he said, too casually, like it was a rehearsed line. I pressed him, told him I'd seen him, that I wasn't imagining it. But he just kept denying it, over and over, his tone too calm, too smooth. After a minute, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Maybe you need some sleep. You're looking a bit tired." That touch felt wrong. I can't explain why, but it sent a chill down my spine. I pulled away, and his hand dropped, that empty smile still on his face. I left the break room, feeling more uneasy than ever. The rest of that shift, I avoided him as much as I could. But every time I think I was alone, I'd see him again, half hidden behind a machine, peeking around a corner, always watching. I'd try to confront him, but he'd slip away before I got close. At one point, I went to the control room where we had the security cameras, hoping to catch him in the act. I rewound the footage from earlier that night, and there it was, me, walking between machines, checking everything. And then there he was, just as I'd seen him, his head poking out from behind a machine, watching me. But there was something off in the video. His face was blurred, almost like the camera couldn't focus on him. I kept watching, my pulse racing as I saw myself walking away from the camera, and there he was again, slipping out from behind a different machine, watching me go. He never moved quickly, just seemed to drift from spot to spot, following. It made me sick. I couldn't watch anymore. I decided that night would be my last shift. I had enough. I didn't even clock out. I just walked out, got into my car, and drove home, the cold sweat clinging to my skin. I felt like I'd escaped something dark and twisted that I couldn't explain. I didn't go back after that. I quit, and I haven't spoken to John since. Every now and then, though, when I'm alone in a quiet place, I feel it, that same prickling on the back of my neck, like he's watching me from a distance. And in the worst moments, I'll catch a glimpse of something, someone, just out of the corner of my eye, hiding, waiting. I don't think it's over. I had been working a stressful job for the last few months, so when I finally got a weekend off, I decided to get away for a bit. I booked a small, remote cabin in the woods, about 2 hours away from the city. The kind of place where there's no phone service, no internet, just peace and quiet. Perfect for getting my head straight. I got there late on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting, and I could already feel the tension from work start to melt away. The cabin was rustic, a little older than I expected, but it was cozy. It had one of those old wood-burning stoves and a fireplace that crackled when I lit it. There was no one else around for miles, and I made a point not to mention this trip to anyone, not even on social media. I didn't want anyone to know where I was. I was just there to relax and clear my mind. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the fire. I didn't have any plans for the weekend, just wanted to enjoy the silence. I spent the night watching a movie on my laptop, the kind of thing you do when you're alone in a cabin, listening to the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The cabin was dark, but the moonlight outside provided enough light for me to make my way to the bedroom. I locked all the doors and windows, checked the stove to make sure it was off, and got into bed. The sheets were soft, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually get some sleep. I don't know exactly when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, maybe around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but there was a feeling in the air. Something wasn't right. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the silence of the cabin. For a moment, I thought maybe I had just been imagining things, but then I heard a faint sound. A soft shuffling noise, like something scraping against the wood floor. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, trying to figure out what it was. The house was completely still. No animals, no wind. It was dead quiet. But then I heard it again. The sound of something moving just outside my door. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe an animal outside, but then the sound came again, this time, much closer, like something was right outside my door. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. Then came a faint tap on the door. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one knew I was here. The tap was soft, almost like someone was trying to be quiet, but I could still hear it clearly. I wasn't sure if I should check or not. Part of me thought I should just ignore it, that maybe I was just hearing things. But the other part of me, the part that was suddenly scared, wanted to know who it was. I got out of bed slowly, making sure not to make any noise. My feet hit the cold wood of the floor as I tiptoed toward the door. I didn't dare open it, but I stood close to the edge, trying to listen. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and I held my breath. For what felt like forever, there was no sound. Then, out of nowhere, there was a soft slide under the door. I jumped back, almost falling over. My heart was racing now. Something had been slipped under the door. I didn't know what it was, but the thought of someone being out there, so close, sent a chill through me. I felt trapped, like I couldn't get away from whatever it was. I walked carefully to the door, my legs weak with nerves. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know. I bent down slowly, reaching for the paper that had been left there. When I looked at it, my stomach dropped. The letter was handwritten in neat, careful handwriting. It said, "I saw you take a walk this afternoon. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I wonder what you did out there." My head spun. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anything. The idea that someone was out there, watching me, made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, the letter in my hand, trying to think. It didn't make sense. How could someone know where I'd been? I had stayed on the path all day, far away from the cabin. I hadn't seen a soul. I hadn't even thought to lock the door when I went out. But there was no way someone had followed me that day, right? I started to panic. I looked around the room like I might spot someone, but there was nothing. Just a normal, empty cabin. I couldn't even bring myself to check outside. What if someone was watching me now? I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and tried to go back to bed, but sleep was impossible. The feeling of being watched kept me awake, the letter burning in my mind. I kept imagining someone out there in the woods, hiding, just waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I spent most of the time inside the cabin, looking out the windows, paranoid. I didn't go outside much. I didn't want to risk being seen. The whole day felt off, like something was lingering in the air. It wasn't until I finally decided to leave that I realized the door had been unlocked. The handle had been moved, just enough for me to see it had been tampered with. But I was sure I'd locked it before I went out. That night, I didn't know what to expect. I was too scared to sleep, too scared to stay in the cabin. I waited for hours, my mind racing, and then, just as the night before, there was another tap on the door. Quiet. Deliberate. I didn't even bother checking the door this time. I just grabbed my things, and without a second thought, I ran. I didn't even know where I was going at first, but I just needed to get away. I didn't care if it was dark or if I had no plan. I had to leave the cabin. As I walked through the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I don't know why I didn't call the police. Maybe I was just too scared, or maybe it didn't feel real. But the farther I got from the cabin, the more I felt like I was finally free. When I finally reached the nearest road and found a car to get me back into town, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't go back for my things, and I didn't think I ever would. I'm not sure who was watching me, or why they were doing it. But after that night, I never went back to that cabin. And I never will. I used to do my laundry at the 24-hour laundromat a couple blocks from my apartment. It was old, small, and pretty run down, but it was the only place close by that didn't charge a fortune. I always went late at night since I didn't like the crowds, and honestly, I thought it would be safer. I didn't expect anyone to be around at that hour, maybe just the occasional person passing through. That night was quiet. The only sounds were the low hum of the machines and the clinking of coins as I loaded them in. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting this dim, cold light across the whole place. I kept my head down, folding clothes while I waited for the dryer to finish. I didn't pay much attention to anything around me at first. Then I noticed him. I glanced up, and there he was, standing outside, just beyond the glass doors. He was just staring right through the glass, watching me like he was studying something. His eyes didn't move, his gaze was fixed straight on me, not looking at anything else. It was unsettling, but I tried to tell myself he was just waiting for someone or maybe taking a break if he worked nearby. I tried to ignore it. I went back to folding, keeping my head down, focusing on the shirts in front of me. But I could feel him watching. Every time I looked up, he hadn't moved. He was still there, just standing, with this strange blank look on his face. I tried to brush it off. Told myself it was nothing. A few minutes went by, and I thought he might have left, but then I looked up, and he was gone. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I was just making a big deal out of nothing. I let myself relax, focusing on the warmth coming from the dryer as I took out my clothes. But then, just as I was about to finish, I heard the sound of the door creaking open. I looked up, and there he was, stepping inside the laundromat. He didn't say anything. He just stood near the door, looking around, almost like he was pretending to be interested in the machines. He didn't have any laundry with him, didn't look like he was here for that at all. I kept my head down, telling myself to just ignore him, that he'd leave once he saw I wasn't paying attention. But he started walking over, slow, taking these soft steps that barely made any noise. My heart was pounding, but I tried to act normal, pretending I was focused on my laundry. Then he stopped, just a few feet away from me, close enough that I could feel his presence. "You here alone?" he asked, his voice low, almost like a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I thought maybe if I ignored him, he'd get the hint. But he didn't move. He just stood there, waiting, his eyes fixed on me like he could see right through me. I finally forced myself to look up, trying to keep my voice steady as I replied, "I'm just finishing up." He nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he took a step closer, still staring. He looked so calm, almost like he was waiting for something, some signal to move. I felt this deep sense of unease settle in, like I needed to get out of there right then. I glanced at the clock, hoping it would be a decent time to call someone, but it was past midnight. No one would be awake. "You come here often?" he asked, his tone casual, like we were just two people chatting. I forced a nod, keeping my eyes on my laundry, folding each piece as quickly as I could. He moved closer again, stepping right into my space. I felt trapped, cornered between him and the row of washers. I could feel his eyes on me, every move I made, like he was studying me, waiting for a reaction. He didn't say anything after that. Just kept standing there, so close I could smell his stale breath, the faint smell of smoke clinging to him. I was just focused on my hands, trying to stay calm, telling myself he'd get bored and leave. But he didn't. "You know, I forgot something here last time," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Thought I'd come back and look for it." I just nodded again, not wanting to engage. I was scared. The way he was looking at me felt wrong, like he was enjoying how uncomfortable I was. I started to edge toward my laundry bag, hoping he wouldn't notice, that I could just grab my stuff and leave. But he noticed. He moved his arm, blocking my way, forcing me to look up at him. His eyes were dark, empty, almost like there was nothing behind them. "You in a hurry?" he asked, a slight smile forming on his face. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I've got to go." He just stood there, that creepy smile not moving. I started to feel my pulse quicken, the air around me suddenly feeling thick, like it was hard to breathe. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I just needed to get past him, get to the door. I didn't care about leaving the laundry behind. I took a step back, and he took a step forward. My heart was pounding so loud, I could barely hear anything else. I felt my throat tighten. I took another step back, and he mirrored me, each of us moving in this strange, silent dance, like he was taunting me. Finally, I managed to break away, moving around him, keeping my eyes on the door. But just as I was about to reach it, he grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, almost painful. I looked up at him, my stomach twisting. "You're leaving already?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to pull my arm free, but he held on. His hand was cold, and his grip was firm. I could feel the panic rising in me, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. "I've got to go," I said, barely managing to get the words out. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't let go. He just looked at me, that same empty stare, like he was trying to decide something. I thought about screaming, but I didn't know if anyone would hear me. The laundromat was isolated, with no one around at this time of night. Then, finally, he released me. I stumbled back, grabbing my things as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them. I didn't look back, didn't say anything else. I just bolted for the door, my heart racing as I stepped out into the cold night air. As I walked home, I felt his eyes on me, even though I didn't look back to check if he was watching. I just kept walking, my mind replaying everything that had just happened, my stomach twisting with fear. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment, locking the door behind me, my hands still trembling. After that night, I couldn't go back to that laundromat. I started going to one across town, no matter how inconvenient it was. I didn't care. I never wanted to see that man again, never wanted to feel that kind of fear. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's watching me. I have always loved camping, especially alone. There is something freeing about being out in the wilderness, away from all the noise and distractions of everyday life. I decided to spend a weekend at Big Bend National Park, a place known for its beauty and solitude. I had my tent set up, and the vastness of the stars above was stunning. The peace of the night surrounded me as I settled in with a book, the flickering light of my lantern casting shadows around the campsite. As the hours passed, I started to hear sounds in the distance. At first, it was just the rustling of leaves, the sounds of the night. Then I heard laughter. It was faint but unmistakable, and it made me sit up in my sleeping bag. I listened closely, trying to determine where it was coming from. The laughter grew louder, mixed with voices, and it seemed to be coming from a nearby area. A knot formed in my stomach, and I felt a strange mix of curiosity and caution. It was late, but I felt compelled to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to push away the unease creeping in. I had been told that this park was safe, that the people who ventured here were usually friendly. I slipped out of my tent and walked towards the sounds, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The laughter guided me to a clearing not far from my camp. There, I found a group of people gathered around a bonfire, the flames dancing high and casting a warm glow on their faces. They were laughing and talking, their voices ringing out in the stillness of the night. I felt a bit relieved but also on edge. I was not expecting to find others this far out. As I approached, they noticed me and turned their heads. Their smiles were wide, and they waved me over. "Hey there. Come join us," one of them called out. I felt a mixture of warmth and wariness. They seemed inviting, but something about the way they looked at me made me hesitate. I stepped closer, trying to read the situation. The group was a mix of men and women, all looking to be in their 20s or 30s. They wore casual clothes, and their laughter seemed genuine. I was almost ready to sit down when I noticed how their eyes kept drifting towards my backpack. It was resting against a nearby rock, my only source of food and water for the night. "Nice backpack you got there," another person said, a grin stretching across his face. I forced a smile, trying to keep the mood light. "Thanks. Just some supplies for the night." They nodded, but the way they kept glancing at it made my skin crawl. I tried to change the subject. "What brings you all out here?" "We come out here often," a woman replied, her voice cheerful. "Just to get away from everything, you know? The stars are incredible here." "Yeah," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "I love the stars." But as I spoke, I noticed their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. It was as if they were playing a part, and I was the audience. They invited me to sit by the fire, and I felt compelled to join them, despite my instincts telling me to leave. As I settled onto a log, The warmth of the flames enveloped me, and I felt a bit more at ease. But that feeling quickly faded as they resumed their conversation, laughter ringing out with an edge I could not place. "Hey, you should show us what's in your backpack," one of the men suggested suddenly. His tone was playful, but there was a seriousness behind it that made my heart race. I forced a laugh, feeling the tension rise in my chest. "Oh, it's just some food and a few supplies. Nothing special. Come on, we're all friends here." "Let's see it," he pressed, leaning forward, his gaze intense. I glanced at the others, and they all nodded, their eyes eager. A wave of unease washed over me. Something was off. This wasn't just friendly curiosity. "I really need to keep it safe," I said, my voice steady despite the fear building inside me. "It's important to me." The group exchanged glances, and I could feel the mood shift, their previous warmth fading into something colder. "Important, huh?" another man said, his voice low. "What's so important that you can't share it with friends?" I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I forced myself to smile, but inside, I was panicking. "Just some personal items. I promise it's nothing interesting." The laughter stopped. The fire crackled, and silence enveloped us. I could feel the weight of their stares, assessing, waiting. I needed to leave. "I should really get back to my campsite," I said, standing up abruptly. The group shifted, and the tension in the air became palpable. "Thank you for the invitation, but Before I could finish, one of the women stood up as well. "Wait. Don't go just yet. We were having such a nice time." Her smile was tight, and it felt forced. I turned, my heart pounding, and took a few steps back. "I really need to go," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. Suddenly, the man who had first spoken stepped closer. "Come on, don't be rude. Just share with us. We only want to have a good time." I could sense the shift in their demeanor, the way they surrounded me like wolves closing in on prey. I took another step back, feeling the fear rise inside me like a wave. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just want to go back." They paused, and for a moment, it seemed like they were reconsidering. Then the woman said, "Why don't you just let us take a look? We can help you with whatever is in there." I turned and ran. The laughter from behind me turned into shouts as I bolted into the darkness. I didn't look back, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt the fear propelling me forward, guiding my steps as I raced back towards my campsite. I stumbled through the trees, branches clawing in my arms, the night closing in around me. The path felt endless, and I could hear their voices behind me, but I didn't dare to stop. I burst through the clearing where my tent was set up, my breath coming in gasps. I quickly unzipped my tent and threw myself inside, zipping it up tightly behind me. I grabbed my phone, the only source of light I had left, and I huddled in the corner, trying to calm my racing heart. The laughter and voices from the bonfire faded into the night, but I did not dare to relax. I spent the rest of the night listening, waiting for any sign that they had followed me. When morning finally came, I emerged from my tent, the sun casting a warm glow over the park. I was shaken but relieved to see that the group was gone. I quickly packed my things, feeling the need to leave this place behind. As I drove away from Big Bend, the beautiful landscape blurred through the window. The adventure I had sought had turned into a nightmare. I vowed to be more cautious in the future, to trust my instincts. The wilderness was not just a beautiful escape, it could also hold dangers I never imagined. I left with a heavy heart, knowing that the night had changed something inside me forever. I worked a graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store, just me, the buzzing lights, and that ticking clock. It was the kind of job where nothing really happened, just quiet hours with the occasional late-night shopper. People would shuffle in, grab a drink or snack, maybe some smokes, then leave. And I was fine with that. I liked the quiet. But then he started showing up. It was sometime in early September. I remember that night because the air felt heavy, like it might rain. He was just standing across the street, right by the old lamppost that flickered on and off. I noticed him, thought maybe he was waiting for a ride or something, but he just stayed there. No movement, no one else around. At first, I tried not to think too much of it. I kept myself busy, stocked the shelves, cleaned the counter, anything to pass the time. But every time I looked up, he was still there, just staring. It's like he was waiting for something. The next night, he was there again, in the same spot, same stance, arms crossed. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or 40s, with a bit of a scruffy look. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, nothing that really stood out, but the way he watched, it wasn't normal. I could feel it, that prickle on the back of my neck. I kept telling myself maybe he was just some guy who lived nearby, maybe waiting for someone. But he never crossed the street, never came inside. He didn't come every night, just enough that I started to expect it. Sometimes it'd be 2 nights in a row, then he'd skip a day, then back again. It made me uneasy, but I couldn't really do anything about it. He wasn't breaking any laws by just standing there. Then, one night, about a week later, he finally came inside. It was around 2 in the morning. The store was empty, like usual, just me and the hum of the freezers in the back. I was restocking the drink fridge when I heard the bell over the door. I looked up, and there he was, stepping in. He didn't look at me right away, just walked down the first aisle, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. I tried to act normal, just went back to stocking the shelves, but I could feel him watching me from the corner of his eye as he walked slowly through the store. He wasn't looking at the products or grabbing anything, just lingering, one aisle at a time. I kept telling myself not to freak out, that maybe he was finally here to buy something, that it was all just in my head. But then he turned down my aisle, just a few feet away, and stopped. He looked at me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. His gaze was intense, like he was looking right through me. "Hi, Claire," he said. I froze. I hadn't told him my name. I was sure of that. I didn't wear a name tag or anything. There was no way he could have known. My mind raced, trying to think if I'd slipped up somehow, but I knew I hadn't. I forced a smile, tried to play it cool. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer right away, just kept staring. Then he tilted his head, almost like he was sizing me up. "You're here alone, aren't you?" he said, like he was making small talk, but his voice was low, calm. Too calm. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I didn't want him to know I was alone. I cleared my throat, shrugged. "Not always," I said, hoping it sounded believable. "My manager comes in around 3. He just smiled, a thin, tight smile. "I know you're here alone, Claire," he said, his voice steady, almost amused. I wanted to scream or run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I was in my own store, with cameras watching. I kept my voice even, trying to sound unfazed. "Look, if you don't need anything, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He took a step closer, too close for comfort, and I could feel my heart racing. "You shouldn't be working here by yourself," he said, like he was giving me advice, like he was concerned for me. "It's dangerous, especially at night." I backed up a little, moving towards the counter where I had a phone under the register. I glanced over at it, hoping he didn't notice, but he did. I could see it in his eyes. He knew exactly what I was thinking. "Don't worry," he said, a bit of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just wanted to see you up close." His words made my skin crawl. I tried to think of what to say, something that would get him to leave, but my mind was blank. All I could do was stare at him, my throat dry, my hands shaking. Finally, he stepped back, giving me a little space, but he didn't turn to leave. "I'll see you around, Claire," he said, like he was making a promise. Then he walked out, as calm as he'd come in, and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a man came into the store and acted strange? They wouldn't take me seriously. After that, I kept an eye out for him every night, just waiting for him to come back. And he did. Sometimes he'd just stand outside, watching. Other nights, he'd come in, wander around without buying anything, then leave. And every time he'd call me by name. I started dreading my shifts. I didn't feel safe anymore. I tried telling my boss, but he just shrugged it off, said I was overreacting. People are weird sometimes, he told me, like that was supposed to make me feel better. One night, when I couldn't take it anymore, I confronted him. He'd come in, lingered around as usual, and I just snapped. "Why do you keep coming here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He looked at me, that same unsettling smile on his face. "I just like seeing you," he said, his voice soft. "I feel like we know each other." "We don't," I said, my voice firm. "Stop coming here." His smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Anger, maybe. He took a step closer, and I could feel the tension in the air. "Careful, Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to make me angry." I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed silent, watching as he finally turned and left. That was the last time I saw him. I don't know why he stopped coming after that. Maybe he found someone else to follow, someone else to watch. I quit the job not long after that. I couldn't stay there, not knowing if he'd show up again. Even now, I still look over my shoulder, still feel like he's out there somewhere, watching. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I was out late, around 10:30, walking my dog, Daisy. I don't normally go that late, but I had a busy day, and she was getting antsy. I didn't think much of it since our neighborhood is quiet, even at night. I could go a whole block without seeing anyone, maybe a car passing here or there, but that's about it. We'd only gone a few minutes when I noticed a guy across the street, standing on the corner. At first, I thought he was just waiting for someone or taking a smoke break, something like that. He was looking our way, but I tried to ignore it. We were just out for a walk, right? I didn't owe anyone my attention. Daisy was sniffing around, as usual, probably taking her sweet time so she could drag the walk out longer. I let her, figuring we'd just take a loop around the block and head back. But when I looked up again, that guy was still there, just watching us. He hadn't moved an inch. Something about it made me uneasy, so I decided to turn down another street. I kept my eyes on Daisy, not wanting to look back and make it obvious I'd noticed him. We walked a little faster, and I hoped that'd be enough to shake whatever strange feeling I had. But as we reached the next block, I felt this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching. I couldn't help it, I glanced over my shoulder. He'd crossed the street. He was on our side now, a few paces behind us, moving at a casual pace, hands in his pockets, like he was out for a late-night stroll. The only problem was, he didn't have a dog with him. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe he lived around here, just taking a walk like I was. That's what I wanted to believe, anyway. I tugged Daisy's leash, trying to subtly speed her up without making it obvious I was hurrying. She resisted at first, taking her nose into some patch of grass like it was the most interesting thing she'd ever smelled. My nerves were on edge, and I gave the leash another tug, a bit firmer this time. Finally, she got the hint and started walking. We turned down another block, but I could hear footsteps behind us. I didn't want to look again, but I couldn't help it. I glanced back, quick, like I was just looking around, and there he was. Closer this time. He still had his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on us, unblinking. When he noticed I was looking, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like he was amused by something. I felt a chill run through me, and I decided enough was enough. I took out my phone, planning to call someone, anyone, just to have a voice on the other end. But before I could dial, I heard him say, "She's got a lot of energy, doesn't she?" I froze. He was talking about Daisy. The casual tone, like we were acquaintances, made my skin crawl. I looked down at Daisy, who was still sniffing around, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. "Yeah, she does," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want him to know how uncomfortable he was making me. "We're just out for a quick walk." He nodded, but he didn't stop walking, just kept pace with us. "She likes to linger, though, doesn't she?" Always curious about everything. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. Daisy did like to sniff around a lot, but how would he know that? I decided to keep my answer short. "Yep. She's a curious dog." I turned to walk faster, hoping he'd take the hint, but he matched my pace, staying just a step behind. "You know, she's been like that since she was a puppy," he continued, like he was reminiscing about her. That stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at him directly, feeling a rush of anger and fear. "How would you know that?" He just shrugged, smiling that same unsettling smile. "I've seen you around. You and Daisy. She's a good dog, always well behaved." I hadn't seen this man before in my life. I was sure of it. And yet he was talking like he knew us, like he'd been watching us for a long time. My mind started racing, trying to figure out if I'd seen him somewhere, maybe in passing, but nothing came up. I decided it was time to go. "Have a good night," I said, forcing a polite smile, and turned to walk away, tugging Daisy along with me. But before I could take a step, he said, "You really shouldn't pull on her leash like that. She doesn't like it." I felt a wave of nausea. Daisy did hate it when I pulled her leash, but there was no way he could know that unless he'd been watching us, studying us. I didn't look back this time. I just started walking, fast, practically dragging Daisy along, hoping to put some distance between us. But then I heard his footsteps again. Faster this time, closing the gap. "Hey, I'm just trying to help," he called out, his voice getting louder, more insistent. "I know Daisy pretty well. I could give you some tips if you're having trouble with her." My heart was pounding, and I could feel my hands shaking. I didn't respond, just kept moving, trying to stay calm. Daisy, sensing my anxiety, started pulling forward, which was a relief. She was finally helping me get out of there. But then he spoke again, his voice so close now I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. "She doesn't like strangers, does she?" he said, almost in a whisper. That was enough. I broke into a full sprint, practically dragging Daisy with me as I ran toward home. I didn't care if he was following or if he thought I was being rude. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance as I could between me and that man. When I reached my house, I fumbled with the keys, hands trembling as I tried to unlock the door. I could still feel his presence, like he was standing right behind me, just waiting. Finally, the lock clicked, and I shoved the door open, pulling Daisy inside and slamming it shut behind us. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, heart racing as I listened for any sounds outside. I heard nothing, just the quiet of the night, the faint rustle of leaves. I looked out the peephole, but he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. I spent the rest of the night double-checking the locks, peering out the windows, convinced he'd show up again. I didn't get a wink of sleep, every little sound making me jump. But he never came back. For days afterward, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I took Daisy out, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the streets for any sign of him. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night stuck with me, the way he spoke about Daisy like he knew her, like he'd been part of our lives all along. Now, I don't take Daisy out at night anymore. And I don't let my guard down, even during the day.